The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 1. The hush of the court, which had been broken when the foreman of the jury returned their verdict, was intensified as the judge, with a quick glance over his pince nez at the tall prisoner, marshalled his papers with the precision and method which old men display in tense moments such as these. He gathered them together, white paper and blue and buff, and stacked them in a neat heap on a tiny ledge to the left of his desk. Then he took his pen and wrote a few words on a printed paper before him. Another breathless pause, and he groped beneath the desk and brought out a small square of black silk, and carefully laid it over his white wig. Then he spoke. "James Meredith, you have been convicted, after a long and patient trial, of the awful crime of wilful murder. With the verdict of the jury I am in complete agreement. There is little doubt, after hearing the evidence of the unfortunate lady to whom you were engaged, and whose evidence you attempted in the most brutal manner to refute, that, instigated by your jealousy, you shot Ferdinand Bulford. The evidence of Miss Briggerland that you had threatened this poor young man, and that you left her presence in a temper, is unshaken. By a terrible coincidence, Mr. Bulford was in the street outside your fiancée's door when you left, and, maddened by your insane jealousy, you shot him dead. To suggest, as you have through your counsel, that you called at Miss Briggerland's that night to break off your engagement, and that the interview was a mild one, and unattended by recriminations, is to suggest that this lady has deliberately committed perjury in order to swear away your life, and when to that disgraceful charge you produce a motive, namely, that by your death or imprisonment Miss Briggerland, who is your cousin, would benefit to a considerable extent, you merely add to your infamy. Nobody who saw the young girl in the box, a pathetic and, if I may say, a beautiful figure, could accept for one moment your fantastic explanation. Who killed Ferdinand Bulford? A man without an enemy in the world. That tragedy cannot be explained away. It now only remains for me to pass the sentence which the law imposes. The jury's recommendation to mercy will be forwarded to the proper quarter." He then proceeded to pass sentence of death, and the tall man in the dock listened without a muscle of his face moving. So ended the great Berkeley Street murder trial, and when a few days later it was announced that the sentence of death had been commuted to one of penal servitude for life, there were newspapers and people who hinted at mistaken leniency, and suggested that James Meredith would have been hanged if he were a poor man instead of being, as he was, the master of vast wealth. "That's that," said Jack Glover between his teeth, as he came out of court with the eminent King's counsel who had defended his friend and client. "The little lady wins." His companion looked sideways at him and smiled. "Honestly, Glover, do you believe that poor girl could do so dastardly a thing as lie about the man she loves?" "She loves?" repeated Jack Glover witheringly. "I think you are prejudiced," said the counsel, shaking his head. "Personally, I believe that Meredith is a lunatic. I am satisfied that all he told us about the interview he had with the girl was born of a diseased imagination. I was terribly impressed when I saw Jean Briggerland in the box. By Jove, there is the lady." They had reached the entrance of the court. A big car was standing by the curb, and one of the attendants was holding open the door for a girl dressed in black. They had a glimpse of a pale, sad face of extraordinary beauty, and then she disappeared behind the drawn blinds. The counsel drew a long sigh. "Mad," he said huskily. "He must be mad. If ever I saw a pure soul in a woman's face, it is in hers." "You've been in the sun, Sir John. You're getting sentimental," said Jack Glover brutally, and the eminent lawyer choked indignantly. Jack Glover had a trick of saying rude things to his friends, even when those friends were 20 years his senior, and by every rule of professional etiquette entitled to respectful treatment. "Really," said the outraged Sir John, "there are times, Glover, when you are insufferable." But by this time Jack Glover was swinging along the Old Bailey, his hands in his pockets, his silk hat on the back of his head. He found the grey-haired senior member of the firm of Rennett, Glover and Simpson (there had been no Simpson in the firm for 10 years) on the point of going home. Mr. Rennett sat down at the sight of his junior. "I heard the news by 'phone," he said. "Ellbery says there's no ground for appeal, but I think the recommendation to mercy will save his life. Besides, it's a crime passionnel, and they don't hang for homicidal jealousy. I suppose it was the girl's evidence that turned the trick." Jack nodded. "And she looked like an angel just out of the refrigerator," he said despairingly. "Ellbery did his poor best to shake her, but the old fool is half in love with her. I left him raving about her pure soul and her other celestial et ceteras." Mr. Rennett stroked his iron grey beard. "She's won," he said, but the other turned on him with a snarl. "Not yet," he said almost harshly. "She hasn't won till Jimmy Meredith is dead or," repeated his partner significantly. "That or won't come off, Jack. He'll get a life sentence as sure as eggs is eggs. I'd go a long way to help Jimmy. I'd risk my practice and my name." Jack Glover looked at his partner in astonishment. "You old sportsman," he said admiringly. "I didn't know you were so fond of Jimmy." Mr. Rennett got up and began pulling on his gloves. He seemed a little uncomfortable at the sensation he had created. "His father was my first client," he said apologetically. "One of the best fellows that ever lived. He married late in life. That was why he was such a crank over the question of marriage. You might say that old Meredith founded our firm. Your father and Simpson and I were nearly at our last gasp when Meredith gave us his business. That was our turning point. Your father, God rest him, was never tired of talking about it. I wonder he never told you." "I think he did," said Jack thoughtfully. "And you really would go a long way, Rennett, to help Jim Meredith?" "All the way," said old Rennett shortly. Jack Glover began whistling a long, lugubrious tune. "I'm seeing the old boy to-morrow," he said. "By the way, Rennett, did you see that a fellow had been released from prison to a nursing home for a minor operation the other day? There was a question asked in Parliament about it. Is it usual?" "It can be arranged," said Rennett. "Why?" "Do you think in a few months' time we could get Jim Meredith into a nursing home for, say, an appendix operation?" "Has he appendicitis?" asked the other in surprise. "He can fake it," said Jack calmly. "It's the easiest thing in the world to fake." Rennett looked at the other under his heavy eyebrows. "You're thinking of the ore?" he challenged, and Jack nodded. "It can be done, if he's alive," said Rennett after a pause. "He'll be alive," prophesied his partner. "Now the only thing is, where shall I find the girl?" The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 2. Lydia Beale gathered up the scraps of paper that littered her table, rolled them into a ball, and tossed them into the fire. There was a knock at the door, and she half turned in her chair to meet with a smile her stout landlady, who came in carrying a tray on which stood a large cup of tea and 2 thick and wholesome slices of bread and jam. "Finished, Miss Beale?" asked the landlady anxiously. "For the day, yes," said the girl with a nod, and stood up, stretching herself stiffly. She was slender, a head taller than the dumpy Mrs. Morgan. The dark violet eyes and the delicate spiritual face she owed to her Celtic ancestors. The grace of her movements, no less than the perfect hands that rested on the drawing-board, spoke eloquently of breed. "I'd like to see it, miss, if I may," said Mrs. Morgan, wiping her hands on her apron in anticipation. Lydia pulled open a drawer of the table and took out a large sheet of Windsor board. She had completed her pencil sketch, and Mrs. Morgan gasped appreciatively. It was a picture of a masked man holding a villainous crowd at bay at the point of a pistol. "That's wonderful, miss," she said in awe. "I suppose those sorts of things happen, too." The girl laughed as she put the drawing away. "They happen in stories which I illustrate, Mrs. Morgan," she said dryly. "The real brigands of life come in the shape of lawyers' clerks with writs and summonses. It's a relief from those mad fashion plates I draw, anyway. Do you know, Mrs. Morgan, that the sight of a dressmaker's shop window makes me positively ill?" Mrs. Morgan shook her head sympathetically, and Lydia changed the subject. "Has anybody been this afternoon?" she asked. "Only the young man from Spadd and Newton," replied the stout woman with a sigh. "I told him you was out, but I'm a bad liar." The girl groaned. "I wonder if I shall ever get to the end of those debts," she said in despair. "I've enough writs in the drawer to paper the house, Mrs. Morgan." 3 years ago Lydia Beale's father had died, and she had lost the best friend and companion that any girl ever had. She knew he was in debt, but had no idea how extensively he was involved. A creditor had seen her the day after the funeral, and had made some uncouth reference to the convenience of a death which had automatically cancelled George Beale's obligations. It needed only that to spur the girl to an action which was as foolish as it was generous. She had written to all the people to whom her father owed money, and had assumed full responsibility for debts amounting to hundreds of pounds. It was the Celt in her that drove her to shoulder the burden which she was ill-equipped to carry, but she had never regretted her impetuous act. There were a few creditors who, realising what had happened, did not bother her, and there were others. She earned a fairly good salary on the staff of the Daily Megaphone, which made a feature of fashion, but she would have had to have been the recipient of a cabinet minister's emoluments to have met the demands which flowed in upon her a month after she had accepted her father's obligations. "Are you going out to-night, miss?" asked the woman. Lydia roused herself from her unpleasant thoughts. "Yes, I'm making some drawings of the dresses in Curfew's new play. I'll be home somewhere around 12. Mrs. Morgan was half-way across the room when she turned back. "One of these days you'll get out of all your troubles, miss. You see if you don't. I'll bet you'll marry a rich young gentleman." Lydia, sitting on the edge of the table, laughed. "You'd lose your money, Mrs. Morgan," she said. "Rich young gentlemen only marry poor working girls in the kind of stories I illustrate. If I marry, it will probably be a very poor young gentleman who will become an incurable invalid and want nursing, and I shall hate him so much that I can't be happy with him, and pity him so much that I can't run away from him." Mrs. Morgan sniffed her disagreement. "There are things that happen," she began. "Not to me, not miracles, anyway," said Lydia, still smiling, "and I don't know that I want to get married. I've got to pay all these bills first, and by the time they are settled I'll be a grey-haired old lady in a mob cap." Lydia had finished her tea, and was standing somewhat scantily attired in the middle of her bedroom, preparing for her theatre engagement, when Mrs. Morgan returned. "I forgot to tell you, miss," she said, "there was a gentleman and a lady called." "A gentleman and a lady? Who were they?" "I don't know, Miss Beale. I was lying down at the time, and the girl answered the door. I gave her strict orders to say that you were out." "Did they leave any name?" "No, miss. They just asked if Miss Beale lived here, and could they see her." Said Lydia with a frown. "I wonder what we owe them." She dismissed the matter from her mind, and thought no more of it until she stopped on her way to the theatre to learn from the office by telephone the number of drawings required. The chief sub-editor answered her. "And by the way," he added, "there was an inquiry for you at the office to-day. I found a note of it on my desk when I came in to-night. Some old friends of yours who want to see you. Brand told them you were going to do a show at the Irving Theatre to-night, so you'll probably see them." "Who are they?" she asked, puzzled. She had few friends, old or new. "I haven't the foggiest idea," was the reply. At the theatre she saw nobody she knew, though she looked around interestedly, nor was she approached in any of the entr'actes. In the row ahead of her and a little to her right were two people who regarded her curiously as she entered. The man was about 50, very dark and bald. The skin of his head was almost copper-coloured, though he was obviously a European, for the eyes which beamed benevolently upon her through powerful spectacles were blue, but so light a blue that by contrast with the mahogany skin of his clean-shaven face they seemed almost white. The girl who sat with him was fair, and to Lydia's artistic eye singularly lovely. Her hair was a mop of fine gold. The colour was natural. Lydia was too sophisticated to make any mistake about that. Her features were regular and flawless. The young artist thought she had never seen so perfect a Cupid mouth in her life. There was something so freshly, fragrantly innocent about the girl that Lydia's heart went out to her, and she could hardly keep her eyes on the stage. The unknown seemed to take almost as much interest in her, for twice Lydia surprised her backward scrutiny. She found herself wondering who she was. The girl was beautifully dressed, and about her neck was a platinum chain that must have hung to her waist, a chain which was broken every few inches by a big emerald. It required something of an effort of concentration to bring her mind back to the stage and her work. With a book on her knee, she sketched the somewhat bizarre costumes which had aroused a mild public interest in the play, and for the moment forgot her entrancing companion. She came through the vestibule at the end of the performance, and drew her worn cloak more closely about her slender shoulders, for the night was raw, and a sou'westerly wind blew the big wet snowflakes under the protecting glass awning into the lobby itself. The favoured playgoers minced daintily through the slush to their waiting cars. Then taxis came into the procession of waiting vehicles. There was a banging of cab doors, a babble of orders to the scurrying attendants, until something like order was evolved from the chaos. "Cab, miss?" Lydia shook her head. An omnibus would take her to Fleet Street, but two had passed, packed with passengers, and she was beginning to despair when a particularly handsome taxi pulled up at the curb. The driver leant over the shining apron, which partially protected him from the weather, and shouted, "Is Miss Beale there?" The girl started in surprise, taking a step toward the cab. "I am Miss Beale," she said. "Your editor has sent me for you," said the man briskly. The editor of the Megaphone had been guilty of many eccentric acts. He had expressed views on her drawing which she shivered to recall. He had aroused her in the middle of the night to sketch dresses at a fancy dress ball. But never before had he done anything so human as to send a taxi for her. Nevertheless, she would not look at the gift cab too closely, and she stepped into the warm interior. The windows were veiled with the snow and the sleet which had been falling all the time she had been in the theatre. She saw blurred lights flash past, and realized that the taxi was going at a good pace. She rubbed the windows, and tried to look out after a while. Then she endeavoured to lower one, but without success. Suddenly she jumped up and tapped furiously at the window to attract the driver's attention. There was no mistaking the fact that they were crossing a bridge, and it was not necessary to cross a bridge to reach Fleet Street. If the driver heard, he took no notice. The speed of the car increased. She tapped at the window again, furiously. She was not afraid, but she was angry. Presently fear came. It was when she tried to open the door and found that it was fastened from the outside that she struck a match to discover that the windows had been screwed tight. The edge of the hole where the screw had gone in was rawly new, and the screw's head was bright and shining. She had no umbrella, she never carried one to the theatre, and nothing more substantial in the shape of a weapon than a fountain pen. She could smash the windows with her foot. She sat back in the seat and discovered that it was not so easy an operation as she had thought. She hesitated even to make the attempt. And then the panic sense left her, and she was her own calm self again. She was not being abducted. These things did not happen in the 20th century, except in sensational books. She frowned. She had said almost the same thing to somebody that day, to Mrs. Morgan, who had hinted at a romantic marriage. Of course, nothing was wrong. The driver had called her by name. Probably the editor wanted to see her at his home. He lived somewhere in South London, she remembered. That would explain everything. And yet her instinct told her that something unusual was happening, that some unpleasant experience was imminent. She tried to put the thought out of her mind, but it was too vivid, too insistent. Again she tried the door, and then, conscious of a faint reflected glow on the cloth-lined roof of the cab, she looked backward through the peep-hole. She saw two great motor-car lamps within a few yards of the cab. A car was following. She glimpsed the outline of it as they ran past a street standard. They were in one of the roads of the outer suburbs. Looking through the window, over the driver's shoulder, she saw trees on one side of the road and a long grey fence. It was while she was so looking that the car behind shot suddenly past and ahead, and she saw its tail lights moving away with a pang of hopelessness. Then, before she realized what had happened, the big car ahead slowed and swung sideways, blocking the road, and the cab came to a jerky stop that flung her against the window. She saw two figures in the dim light of the taxi's headlamps, heard somebody speak, and the door was jerked open. "Will you step out, Miss Beale?" said a pleasant voice, and though her legs seemed queerly weak, she obliged. The second man was standing by the side of the driver. He wore a long raincoat, the collar of which was turned up to the tip of his nose. "You may go back to your friends and tell them that Miss Beale is in good hands," he was saying. "You may also burn a candle or two before your favourite saint in thanksgiving that you are alive." "I don't know what you're talking about," said the driver sulkily. "I'm taking this young lady to her office." "Since when has the Daily Megaphone been published in the ghastly suburbs?" asked the other politely. He saw the girl and raised his hat. "Come along, Miss Beale," he said. "I promise you a more comfortable ride, even if I cannot guarantee that the end will be less startling." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 3. The man who had opened the door was a short, stoutly built person of middle age. He took the girl's arm gently, and without questioning she accompanied him to the car ahead, the man in the raincoat following. No word was spoken, and Lydia was too bewildered to ask questions until the car was on its way. Then the younger man chuckled. "Clever, Rennett," he said. "I tell you those people are superhumanly brilliant." "I'm not a great admirer of villainy," said the other gruffly, and the younger man, who was sitting opposite the girl, laughed. "You must take a detached interest, my dear chap. Personally, I admire them. I admit they gave me a fright when I realized that Miss Beale had not called the cab, but that it had been carefully planted for her, but still I can admire them." "What does it mean?" asked the puzzled girl. "I'm so confused. Where are we going now? To the office?" "I fear you will not get to the office to-night," said the young man calmly. and it is impossible to explain to you just why you were abducted." "Abducted?" said the girl incredulously. "Do you mean to say that man—" "He was carrying you into the country," said the other calmly. "He would probably have travelled all night and have left you stranded in some unget-atable place. I don't think he meant any harm. They never take unnecessary risks, and all they wanted was to spirit you away for the night. How they came to know that we had chosen you baffles me," he said. "Can you advance any theory, Rennett?" "Chosen me?" repeated the startled girl. "Really, I feel I'm entitled to some explanation, and, if you don't mind, I would like you to take me back to my office. I have a job to keep," she added grimly. £6.10 a week, and a few guineas extra for your illustrations," said the man in the raincoat. "Believe me, Miss Beale, you'll never pay off your debts on that salary, not if you live to be 100. She could only gasp. "You seem to know a great deal about my private affairs," she said, when she had recovered her breath. "A great deal more than you can imagine." She guessed he was smiling in the darkness, and his voice was so gentle and apologetic that she could not take offence. "In the past 12 months you have had 39 judgments recorded against you, and in the previous year 27. You are living on exactly 30 shillings a week, and all the rest is going to your father's creditors." "You're very impertinent," she said hotly, and, as she felt, foolishly. "I'm very pertinent, really. By the way, my name is Glover, John Glover, of the firm of Rennett, Glover and Simpson. The gentleman at your side is Mr. Charles Rennett, my senior partner. We are a firm of solicitors, but how long we shall remain a firm," he added pointedly, "depends rather upon you." "Upon me?" said the girl in genuine astonishment. "Well, I can't say that I have so much love for lawyers." "That I can well understand," murmured Mr. Glover. "But I certainly do not wish to dissolve your partnership," she went on. "It is rather more serious than that," said Mr. Rennett, who was sitting by her side. "The fact is, Miss Beale, we are acting in a perfectly illegal manner, and we are going to reveal to you the particulars of an act we contemplate, which, if you pass on the information to the police, will result in our professional ruin. So, you see, this adventure is infinitely more important to us than at present it is to you. And here we are," he said, interrupting the girl's question. The car turned into a narrow drive and proceeded some distance through an avenue of trees before it pulled up at the pillared porch of a big house. Rennett helped her to alight and ushered her through the door, which opened, almost as they stopped, into a large panelled hall. "This is the way, let me show you," said the younger man. He opened a door, and she found herself in a big drawing room, exquisitely furnished, and lit by 2 silver electroliers suspended from the carved roof. To her relief, an elderly woman rose to greet her. "This is my wife, Miss Beale," said Rennett. "I need hardly explain that this is also my home." "So you've found the young lady," said the elderly lady, smiling her welcome. "And what does Miss Beale think of your proposition?" The young man Glover came in at that moment, and, divested of his long raincoat and hat, he proved to be of a type that the universities turn out by the hundred. He was good-looking, too, Lydia noticed with feminine inconsequence, and there was something in his eyes that inspired trust. He nodded with a smile to Mrs. Rennett, then turned to the girl. "Now, Miss Beale, I don't know whether I ought to explain, or whether my learned and distinguished friend prefers to save me the trouble." "Not me," said the elder man hastily. "My dear," he turned to his wife, "I think we'll leave Jack Glover to talk to this young lady." "Doesn't she know?" asked Mrs. Rennett in surprise, and Lydia laughed, although she was feeling far from amused. The possible loss of her employment, the disquieting adventure of the evening, and now this further mystery, all combined to set her nerves on edge. Glover waited until the door closed on his partner and his wife, and seemed inclined to wait a little longer, for he stood with his back to the fire, biting his lips and looking down thoughtfully at the carpet. "I don't know just how to begin, Miss Beale," he said, "and having seen you, my conscience is beginning to work overtime. But I might as well start at the beginning. I suppose you have heard of the Bulford murder?" The girl stared at him. "The Bulford murder?" she said incredulously, and he nodded. "Why, of course, everybody has heard of that." "Then, happily, it is unnecessary to explain all the circumstances," said Jack Glover, with a little grimace of distaste. "I only know," interrupted the girl, "that Mr. Bulford was killed by a Mr. Meredith who was jealous of him, and that Mr. Meredith, when he went into the witness box, behaved disgracefully to his fiancée." "Exactly," nodded Glover, with a twinkle in his eye. "In other words, he repudiated the suggestion that he was jealous, swore that he had already told Miss Briggerland that he could not marry her, and he did not even know that Bulford was paying attention to the lady." "He did that to save his life," said Lydia quietly. "Miss Briggerland swore in the witness box that no such interview had occurred." Glover nodded. "What you do not know, Miss Beale," he said gravely, "is that Jean Briggerland was Meredith's cousin, and, unless certain things happen, she will inherit the greater part of £600,000 from Meredith's estate. Meredith, I might explain, is one of my best friends, and the fact that he is now serving out a life sentence does not make him any less a friend. I am as sure as I am sure of your sitting there that he no more killed Bulford than I did. I believe the whole thing was a plot to secure his death or imprisonment. My partner thinks the same. The truth is that Meredith was engaged to this girl. He discovered certain things about her and her father which are not greatly to their credit. He was never really in love with her, beautiful as she is, and he was trapped into the proposal. When he found out how things were shaping, and heard some of the queer stories which were told about Briggerland and his daughter, he broke off the engagement, and went that night to tell her so." The girl had listened in some bewilderment to this recital. "I don't exactly see what all this is to do with me," she said, and again Jack Glover nodded. "I can quite understand," he said, "but I will tell you yet another part of the story which is not public property. Meredith's father was an eccentric man who believed in early marriages, and it was a condition of his will that if Meredith was not married by his 30th birthday, the money should go to his sister, her heirs and successors. His sister was Mrs. Briggerland, who is now dead. Her heirs are her husband and Jean Briggerland." There was a silence. The girl stared thoughtfully into the fire. "How old is Mr. Meredith?" "He is 30 next Monday," said Glover quietly, "and it is necessary that he should be married before next Monday." "In prison?" she asked. He shook his head. "If such things are allowed, that could have been arranged, but for some reason the Home Secretary refuses to exercise his discretion in this matter, and has resolutely refused to allow such a marriage to take place. He objects on the ground of public policy, and I dare say from his point of view he is right. Meredith has a 20-year sentence to serve." "Then how—" began Lydia. "Let me tell this story more or less understandably," said Glover, with that little smile of his. "Believe me, Miss Beale, I'm not so keen upon the scheme as I was. If by chance," he spoke deliberately, "we could get James Meredith into this house to-morrow morning, would you marry him?" "Me?" she gasped. "Marry a man I've not seen? A murderer?" "Not a murderer," he said gently. "But it is preposterous, impossible," she protested. "Why me?" He was silent for a moment. When this scheme was mooted, we looked round for some one to whom such a marriage would be of advantage," he said, speaking slowly. "It was Rennett's idea that we should search the county court records of London to discover if there was a girl who was in urgent need of money. There is no surer way of unearthing financial skeletons than by searching county court records. We found 4, only one of whom was eligible, and that was you. Don't interrupt me for a moment, please," he said, raising his hand warningly as she was about to speak. "We have made thorough inquiries about you, too thorough, in fact, because the Briggerlands have smelled a rat and have been on our trail for a week. We know that you are not engaged to be married, we know that you have a fairly heavy burden of debts, and we know, too, that you are unencumbered by relations or friends. What we offer you, Miss Beale, and believe me, I feel rather a cad in being the medium through which the offer is made, is £5,000 a year for the rest of your life, a sum of £20,000 down, and the assurance that you will not be troubled by your husband from the moment you are married." Lydia listened like one in a dream. It did not seem real. She would wake up presently and find Mrs. Morgan with a cup of tea in her hand and a plate of her indigestible cakes. Such things did not happen, she told herself, and yet here was a young man standing with his back to the fire, explaining in the most commonplace conversational tone an offer which belonged strictly to the realm of romance, and not too convincing romance at that. "You've rather taken my breath away," she said after a while. "All this wants thinking about. And if Mr. Meredith is in prison—" "Mr. Meredith is not in prison," said Glover quietly. "He was released 2 days ago to go to a nursing home for a slight operation. He escaped from the nursing home last night, and at this particular moment is in this house." She could only stare at him open-mouthed, and he went on. "The Briggerlands know he has escaped. They probably thought he was here, because we have had a police visitation this afternoon, and the interior of the house and grounds have been searched. They know, of course, that Mr. Rennett and I were his legal advisers, and we expected them to come. How he escaped their observation is neither here nor there. Now, Miss Beale, what do you say?" "I don't know what to say," she said, shaking her head helplessly. "I know I'm dreaming, and if I had the moral courage to pinch myself hard, I should wake up. Somehow I don't want to wake. It's so fascinatingly impossible." He smiled. "Can I see Mr. Meredith?" "Not till to-morrow. I might say that we've made every arrangement for your wedding. The licence has been secured, and at 8 o'clock to-morrow morning (marriages before 8 or after 3 are not legal in this country, by the way) a clergyman will attend, and the ceremony will be performed." There was a long silence. Lydia sat on the edge of her chair, her elbows on her knees, her face in her hands. Glover looked down at her, seriously, pityingly, cursing himself that he was the exponent of his own grotesque scheme. Presently she looked up. "I think I will," she said a little wearily. "And you were wrong about the number of judgment summonses. There were 75 in 2 years. And I'm so tired of lawyers." "Thank you," said Jack Glover politely. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 4. All night long she had sat in the little bedroom to which Mrs. Rennett had led her, thinking and thinking and thinking. She could not sleep, although she had tried hard, and most of the night she spent pacing up and down from window to door, turning over the amazing situation in which she found herself. She had never thought of marriage seriously, and really a marriage such as this presented no terrors, and might, had the prelude been a little less exciting, but accepted by her with relief. The prospect of being a wife in name only, even the thought that her husband would be for the next 20 years behind prison walls, neither distressed nor horrified her. Somehow she accepted Glover's statement that Meredith was innocent without reservation. She wondered what Mrs. Morgan would say, and what explanation she would give at the office. She was not particularly in love with her work, and it would be no wrench for her to drop it and give herself up to the serious study of art. £5,000 a year. She could live in Italy, study under the best masters, have a car of her own. The possibilities seemed illimitable. And the disadvantages? She shrugged her shoulders as she answered the question for the 20th time. What disadvantages were there? She could not marry, but then she did not want to marry. She was not the kind to fall in love, she told herself. She was too independent, too sophisticated, and understood men and their weaknesses only too well. "The Lord designed me for an old maid," she said to herself. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a grey, cheerless morning it was, thought Lydia, looking out of the window, Mrs. Rennett came in with some tea. "I'm afraid you haven't slept, my dear," she said with a glance at the bed. "It's very trying for you." She laid her hand upon the girl's arm and squeezed it gently. "And it's very trying for all of us," she said with a whimsical smile. "I expect we shall all get into fearful trouble." That had occurred to the girl, too, remembering the gloomy picture which Glover had painted in the car. "Won't this be very serious for you if the authorities find that you have connived at the escape?" she asked. "Escape, my dear?" Mrs. Rennett's face became a mask. "I have not heard anything of an escape. All that we know is that poor Mr. Meredith, anticipating that the Home Office would allow him to get married, had made arrangements for the marriage at this house. How Mr. Meredith comes here is quite a matter outside our knowledge," said the diplomatic lady, and Lydia laughed in spite of herself. She spent half an hour making herself presentable for the forthcoming ordeal. As the church clock struck 8, there came another tap on the door. It was Mrs. Rennett again. "They are waiting," she said. Her face was a little pale, and her lips trembled. Lydia, however, was calmness itself as she walked into the drawing-room ahead of her hostess. There were 4 men. Glover and Rennett she knew. A third man, wearing a clerical collar, she guessed was the officiating priest, and all her attention was concentrated upon the 4th. He was a gaunt, unshaven man, his hair cut short, his face and figure wasted so that the clothes he wore hung on him. Her first feeling was one of revulsion. Her second was an impulse of pity. James Meredith, for she guessed it was he, appeared wretchedly ill. He swung round as she came in and looked at her intently. Then, walking quickly towards her, he held out his thin hand. "Miss Beale, isn't it?" he said. "I'm sorry to meet you under such unpleasant circumstances. Glover has explained everything, has he not?" She nodded. His deep-set eyes had a magnetic quality that fascinated her. "You understand the terms. Glover has told you just why this marriage must take place?" he said, lowering his voice. "Believe me, I am deeply grateful to you for falling in with my wishes." Without preliminary he walked over to where the parson stood. "We will begin now," he said simply. The ceremony seemed so unreal to the girl that she did not realize what it portended, not even when a ring, a loosely fitting ring, for Jack Glover had made the wildest guess at the size, was slipped over her finger. She knelt to receive the solemn benediction, and then got slowly to her feet and looked at her husband strangely. "I think I'm going to faint," she said. It was Jack Glover who caught her and carried her to the sofa. She woke with a confused idea that somebody was trying to hypnotize her, and she opened her eyes to look upon the sombre face of James Meredith. "Better?" he asked anxiously. "I'm afraid you've had a trying time, and no sleep, you said, Mrs. Rennett?" Mrs. Rennett shook her head. "Well, you'll sleep tonight. Better than I shall." He smiled, and then he turned to Rennett, a grave and anxious man who stood nervously stroking his little beard, watching the bridegroom. "Mr. Rennett," he said, "I must tell you, in the presence of witnesses, that I have escaped from a nursing home, to which I had been sent by the clemency of the Secretary of State. When I informed you that I had received permission to come to your house this morning to get married, I told you that which was not true." "I'm sorry to hear that," said Rennett politely, "and of course it is my duty to hand you over to the police, Mr. Meredith." It was all part of the game. The girl watched the play, knowing that this scene was carefully rehearsed in order to absolve Rennett and his partner from complicity in the escape. Rennett had hardly spoken when there was a loud rat-tat at the front door, and Jack Glover hastened into the hall to answer. But it was not the policeman he had expected. It was a girl in a big sable coat, muffled up to her eyes. She pushed past Jack, crossed the hall, and walked straight into the drawing-room. Lydia, standing shakily by Mrs. Rennett's side, saw the visitor come in, and then, as she unfastened her coat, recognized her with a gasp. It was the beautiful girl she had seen in the stalls of the theatre the night before. "And what can we do for you?" It was Glover's voice again, bland and bantering. "I want Meredith," said the girl shortly, and Glover chuckled. "You have wanted Meredith for a long time, Miss Briggerland," he said, "and you're likely to want. You have arrived just a little too late." The girl's eyes fell upon the parson. "Too late?" she said slowly. "Then he is married?" She bit her red lips and nodded. Then she looked at Lydia, and the blue eyes were expressionless. Meredith had disappeared. Lydia looked round for him in her distress, but he had gone. She wondered if he had gone out to the police to make his surrender, and she was still wondering when there came the sound of a shot. It was from the outside of the house, and at the sound Glover ran through the doorway, crossed the hall, and flew into the open. It was still snowing, and there was no sign of any human being. He raced along a path which ran parallel with the house, turned the corner, and dived into a shrubbery. Here the snow had not laid, and he followed the garden path that twisted and turned through the thick laurel bushes, and ended at a roughly built tool house. As he came in sight of the shed, he stopped. A man lay on the ground, his arm extended, his head in a pool of blood, his grey hand clutching a revolver. Jack uttered an exclamation of horror and ran to the side of the fallen man. It was James Meredith, and he was dead.
The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 5. Jack Glover heard footsteps coming down the path and turned to meet a man who had "Detective" written largely all over him. Jack turned and looked down again at the body as the man came up. "Who is this?" asked the officer sharply. "It is James Meredith," said Jack simply. "Dead?" said the officer, startled. "He has committed suicide." Jack did not reply, and watched the inspector as he made his brief examination of the body. A bullet had entered just below the left temple, and there was a mark of powder near the face. "A very bad business, Mr. Glover," said the police officer seriously. "Can you account for this man being here?" "He came to get married," said Jack listlessly. "I dare say that startles you, but it is the fact. He was married less than 10 minutes ago. If you will come up to the house, I will explain his presence here." The detective hesitated, but just then another of his comrades came on the scene, and Jack led the way back to the house through a back door into Rennett's study. The lawyer was waiting for them, and he was alone. "If I'm not very much mistaken, you're Inspector Colid of Scotland Yard," said Glover. "That is my name," nodded the officer. "Between ourselves, Mr. Glover, I don't think I should make any statement which you are not prepared to verify publicly." Jack noted the significance of the warning with a little smile, and proceeded to tell the story of the wedding. "I can only tell you," he said in answer to a further inquiry, "that Mr. Meredith came into this house at 7:45 this morning, and surrendered himself to my partner. At 8 o'clock exactly, as you are well aware, Mr. Rennett telephoned to Scotland Yard to say that Mr. Meredith was here. During the period of his waiting, he was married." "Did a parson happen to be staying here, sir?" asked the police officer sarcastically. "He happened to be staying here," said Jack calmly, "because I had arranged for him to be here. I knew that if it was humanly possible, Mr. Meredith would come to this house, and that his desire was to be married, for reasons which my partner will explain." "Did you help him to escape?" "That is asking you a leading question," smiled the detective. Jack shook his head. "I can answer you with perfect truth that I did not, any more than the Home Secretary helped him when he gave him permission to go to a nursing home." Soon after, the detective returned to the shed, and Jack and his partner were left alone. "Well," said Rennett in a shaking voice, "what happened?" "He's dead," said Jack quietly. "Suicide?" Jack looked at him oddly. "Did Bulford commit suicide?" he asked. "Where is the angel?" "I left her in the drawing room with Mrs. Rennett and Miss Beale." "Mrs. Meredith," corrected Jack quietly. "This complicates matters," said Rennett, "but I think we can get out of our share of the trouble, though it is going to look a little black." They found the three women in the drawing room. Lydia, looking very white, came to meet them. "What happened?" she asked, and then she guessed from his face. "He's not dead," she gasped. Jack nodded. All the time his eyes were on the other girl. Her beautiful lips were drooped a little. There was a look of pain and sorrow in her eyes that caught his breath. "Did he shoot himself?" she asked in a low voice. Jack regarded her coldly. "The only thing that I am certain about," and Lydia winced at the cruelty in his voice, "is that you did not shoot him, Miss Briggerland." "How dare you!" flamed Jean Briggerland. The quick flush that came to her cheek was the only other evidence of emotion she betrayed. "I dare say a lot," said Jack curtly. "You asked me if it is a case of suicide, and I tell you that it is not. It is a case of murder. James Meredith was found with a revolver clutched in his right hand. He was shot through the left temple, and if you'll explain to me how any man holding a pistol in a normal way can perform that feat, I will accept your theory of suicide." There was a dead silence. "Besides," Jack went on with a little shrug, "poor Jimmy had no pistol." Jean Briggerland had dropped her eyes and stood there with downcast head and compressed lips. Presently she looked up. "I know how you feel, Mr. Glover," she said gently. "I can well understand, believing such dreadful things about me as you do, that you must hate me." Her mouth quivered and her voice grew husky with sorrow. "I loved James Meredith," she said, "and he loved me." "He loved you well enough to marry somebody else," said Jack Glover, and Lydia was shocked. "Mr. Glover," she said reproachfully, "do you think it is right to say these things with poor Mr. Meredith lying dead?" He turned slowly toward her, and she saw in his humorous eyes a hardness that she had not seen before. "Miss Briggerland has told us that I hate her," he said in an even voice, "and she spoke nothing but the truth. I hate her perhaps beyond understanding, Mrs. Meredith." He emphasized the words, and the girl winced. "And one day, if the circumstantialists spare me—" "The circumstantialists?" said Jean Briggerland slowly. "I don't quite understand you." Jack Glover laughed, and it was not a pleasant laugh. "Perhaps you will," he said shortly. "As to your loving poor Jim, well, you know best. I am trying to be polite to you, Miss Briggerland, and not to gloat over the fact that you arrived too late to stop this wedding. And shall I tell you why you arrived too late?" His eyes were laughing again. "It was because I had arranged with the Vicar of St. Peter's to be here at 9 o'clock this morning, well knowing that you and your little army of spies would discover the hour of the wedding and would take care to be here before. And then I secretly sent for an old Oxford friend of mine to be here at 8. He was here last night." Still she stood regarding him without visible evidence of the anger which Lydia thought would have been justified. "I had no desire to stop the wedding," said the girl in a low, soft voice. "If Jim preferred to be married in this way to somebody who does not know him, I can only accept his choice." She turned to the girl and held out her hand. "I am very sorry that this tragedy has come to you, Mrs. Meredith," she said. "May I wish you a greater happiness than any you have found." Lydia was touched by the sincerity, hurt a little by Glover's uncouthness, and could only warmly grip the little hand that was held out to her. "I'm sorry, too," she said, a little unsteadily, "for you more than for anything else." The girl lowered her eyes, and again her lips quivered, and then without a word she walked out of the room, pulling her sable wrap about her throat. It was noon before Rennett's car deposited Lydia Meredith at the door of her lodging. She found Mrs. Morgan in a great state of anxiety, and the stout little woman almost shed tears of joy at the sight of her. "Oh, miss, you've no idea how worried I've been," she babbled, "and they've been around here from your newspaper office asking where you are. I thought you had been run over or something, and the Daily Megaphone has sent to all the hospitals." "I have been run over," said Lydia wearily. "My poor mind has been under the wheels of a dozen motor buses, and my soul has been in 100 collisions." Mrs. Morgan gaped at her. She had no sense of metaphor. "It's all right, Mrs. Morgan," laughed her lodger over her shoulder as she went up the stairs. "I haven't really, you know, only I've had a worrying time. And, by the way, my name is Meredith." Mrs. Morgan collapsed onto a hall chair. "Meredith, miss?" she said incredulously. "Why, I knew your father." "I've been married, that's all," said Lydia grimly. "You told me yesterday that I should be married romantically, but even in the wildest flights of your imagination, Mrs. Morgan, you could never have supposed that I should be married in such a violent, desperate way. I'm going to bed." She paused on the landing and looked down at the dumbfounded woman. "If anybody calls for me, I am not at home. Oh, yes, you can tell the Megaphone that I came home very late and that I've gone to bed, and I'll call tomorrow to explain." "But, miss," stammered the woman, "your husband—" "My husband is dead," said the girl calmly. She felt a brute, but somehow she could not raise any note of sorrow. "And if that lawyer man comes, will you please tell him that I shall have 20,000 pounds in the morning?" And with that last staggering statement she went to her room, leaving her landlady speechless. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 6. The police search of the house and grounds at Dulwich Grange, Mr. Rennett's residence, occupied the whole of the morning, and neither Rennett's nor Jack's assistance was invited or offered. Before luncheon, Inspector Colhead came to the study. "We've had a good look round your place, Mr. Rennett," he said, "and I think we know where the deceased hid himself." "Indeed," said Mr. Rennett. That hut of yours in the garden is used, I suppose, for a tool house? There are no tools there now, and one of my men discovered that you can pull up the whole of the floor. It works on a hinge and is balanced with counterweights." Mr. Rennett nodded. "I believe it was used as a wine cellar by a former tenant of the house," he said coolly. "We have no cellars at the Grange, you know. I do not drink wine, and I've never had occasion to use it." "That's where he was hidden. We found a blanket and pillows down there, and as you say, it has obviously been a wine cellar, because there is a ventilating shaft leading up into the bushes. We should never have found the trap, but one of my men felt one of the corners of the floor give under his feet." The two men said nothing. "Another thing," the detective went on slowly, "is that I'm inclined to agree that Meredith did not commit suicide. We found footmarks, quite fresh, leading round to the back of the hut." "A big foot or a little foot?" asked Jack quickly. "It is rather a big foot," said the detective, "and it has rubber heels. We traced it to a gate at the back of your premises, and the gate has been opened recently, probably by Mr. Meredith when he came to the house. It's a queer case, Mr. Rennett." "What is the pistol?" "That's new too," said Colhead. "Belgian make and impossible to trace, I should imagine. You can't keep track of these Belgian weapons. You can buy them in any shop in any town in Ostend or Brussels, and I don't think it is the practice for the sellers to keep any record of the numbers." "In fact," said Jack quietly, "it is the same kind of pistol that killed Bulford." Colhead raised his eyebrows. "So it was, but wasn't it established that that was Mr. Meredith's own weapon?" Jack shook his head. "The only thing that was established was that he had seen the body, and he picked up the pistol which was lying near the dead man. The shot was fired as he opened the door of Mr. Briggerland's house. Then he saw the figure on the pavement and picked up the pistol. He was in that position when Miss Briggerland, who testified against him, came out of the house and saw him." The detective nodded. "I had nothing to do with the case," he said, "but I remember seeing the weapon, and it was identical with this. I'll talk to the chief and let you know what he says about the whole affair. You'll have to give evidence at the inquest, of course." When he had gone, the two men looked at one another. "Well, Rennett, do you think we're going to get into hot water, or are we going to perjure our way to safety?" "There's no need for perjury, not serious perjury," said the other carefully. "By the way, Jack, where was Briggerland the night Bulford was murdered?" "When Miss Jean Briggerland had recovered from her horror, she went upstairs and aroused her father, who, despite the early hour, was in bed and asleep. When the police came, or rather when the detective in charge of the case arrived, which must have been some time after the policeman on point duty put in an appearance, Mr. Briggerland was discovered in a picturesque dressing gown and, I presume, no less picturesque pyjamas." "Horrified too, I suppose," said Rennett dryly. Jack was silent for a long time. Then, "Rennett," he said, "do you know, I am more rattled about this girl than I am about any consequences to ourselves." "Which girl are you talking about?" "About Mrs. Meredith. Whilst poor Meredith was alive, she was in no particular danger. But do you realise that what were advantages from our point of view, namely the fact that she had no relations in the world, are to-day a source of considerable peril to this unfortunate lady?" "I had forgotten that," said Rennett thoughtfully. "What makes matters a little more complicated is the will which Meredith made this morning before he was married." Jack whistled. "Did he make a will?" he said in surprise. His partner nodded. "You remember he was here with me for half an hour. Well, he insisted upon writing out a will, and my wife and Bolton, the butler, witnessed it." "And he has left his money?" "To his wife, "Absolutely," replied the other. "The poor old chap was so frantically keen on keeping the money out of the Briggerland exchequer that he was prepared to entrust the whole of his money to a girl he had not seen." Jack was serious now. "And the Briggerlands are her heirs. Do you realize that, Rennett? There's going to be hell." Mr. Rennett nodded. "I thought that, too," he said quietly. Jack sank down in a seat, his face screwed up into a hideous frown, and the elder man did not interrupt his thoughts. Suddenly Jack's face cleared, and he smiled. "Jaggs," he said softly. "Jaggs?" repeated his puzzled partner. "Jaggs," said Jack, nodding. "He's the fellow. We've got to meet strategy with strategy, Rennett, and Jaggs is the boy to do it." Mr. Rennett looked at him helplessly. "Could Jaggs get us out of our trouble, too?" he asked sarcastically. "He could even do that," replied Jack. "Then bring him along, for I have an idea he'll have the time of his life." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 7. Miss Jean Briggerland reached her home in Berkeley Street soon after 9 o'clock. She did not ring, but let herself in with a key and went straight to the dining room, where her father sat eating his breakfast with a newspaper propped up before him. He was the dark-skinned man whom Lydia had seen at the theatre, and he looked up over his gold-rimmed spectacles as the girl came in. "You have been out very early?" he said. She did not reply, but slowly divesting herself of her sable coat, she threw it onto a chair, took off the toque that graced her shapely head, and flung it after the coat. Then she drew out a chair and sat down at the table, her chin on her palms, her blue eyes fixed upon her parent. Nature had so favoured her that her face needed no artificial embellishment. The skin was clear and fine of texture, and the cold morning had brought only a faint pink to the beautiful face. "Well, my dear," Mr. Briggerland looked up and beamed through his glasses, "so poor Meredith has committed suicide?" She did not speak, keeping her eyes fixed on him. "Very sad, very sad." Mr. Briggerland shook his head. "How did it happen?" she asked quietly. Mr. Briggerland shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose at the sight of you he bolted back to his hiding place where, had been located by, interested persons during the night. Then seeing me by the shed, he committed the rash and fatal act. Somehow I thought he would run back to his dugout." "And you were prepared for him?" she said. He smiled. "A clear case of suicide, my dear," he said. "Shot through the left temple, and the pistol was found in his right hand," said the girl. Mr. Briggerland started. "Damn it," he said. "Who noticed that?" "That good-looking young lawyer, Glover." "Did the police notice?" "I suppose they did when Glover called their attention to the fact," said the girl. Mr. Briggerland took off his glasses and wiped them. "It was done in such a hurry. I had to get back through the garden gate to join the police. When I got there I found they'd been attracted by the shot and had entered the house. Still, nobody would know I was in the garden, and anyway, my association with the capture of an escaped convict would not get into the newspapers." "But a case of suicide would," said the girl, "though I don't suppose the police will give away the person who informed them that James Meredith would be at Dulwich Grange." Mr. Briggerland sat back in his chair, his thick lips pursed, and he was not a beautiful sight. "One can't remember everything," he grumbled. He rose from his chair, went to the door and locked it. Then he crossed to a bureau, pulled open a drawer and took out a small revolver. He threw out the cylinder, glanced along the barrel and the chambers to make sure it was not loaded, then clicked it back in position, and standing before a glass, he endeavoured, the pistol in his right hand, to bring the muzzle to bear on his left temple. He found this impossible, and signified his annoyance with a grunt. Then he tried the pistol with his thumb on the trigger and his hand clasping the back of the butt. Here he was more successful. "That's it," he said with satisfaction. "It could have been done that way." She did not shudder at the dreadful sight, but watched him with the keenest interest, her chin still in the palm of her hand. He might have been explaining a new way of serving a tennis ball for all the emotion he evoked. Mr. Briggerland came back to the table, toyed with a piece of toast and buttered it leisurely. "Everybody is going to Cannes this year," he said, "but I think I shall stick to Monte Carlo. There is a quiet about Monte Carlo which is very restful, especially if one can get a villa on the hill away from the railway. I told Morden yesterday to take the new car across and meet us at Boulogne. He says that the new body is exquisite. There is a microphonic attachment for telephoning to the driver. The electrical heating apparatus is splendid, and Meredith was married. If she had thrown a bomb at him, she could not have produced a more tremendous sensation." He gaped at her and pushed himself back from the table. "Married?" His voice was a squeak. She nodded. "It's a lie!" he roared. All his suavity dropped away from him. His face was distorted and puckered with anger, and grew a shade darker. "Married, you lying little beast! He couldn't have been married. It was only a few minutes after 8, and the parson didn't come till 9. I'll break your neck if you try to scare me. I've told you about that before." He raved on, and she listened unmoved. "He was married at 8 o'clock by a man they brought down from Oxford, and who stayed the night in the house," she repeated with great calmness. "There's no sense in lashing yourself into a rage. I've seen the bride and spoken to the clergyman." From the bullying, raging madman he became a whimpering, pitiable thing. His chin trembled, the big hands he laid on the tablecloth shook with a fever. "What are we going to do?" he wailed. "My God, Jean, what are we going to do?" She rose and went to the sideboard, poured out a stiff dose of brandy from a decanter and brought it across to him without a word. She was used to these tantrums, and to their inevitable ending. She was neither hurt, surprised, nor disgusted. This pale, ethereal being was the dominant partner of the combination. Nerves she did not possess. Fears she did not know. She had acquired the precise sense of a great surgeon in whom pity was a detached emotion, and one which never intruded itself into the operating chamber. She was no more phenomenal than they, save that she did not feel bound by the conventions and laws which govern them as members of an ordered society. It requires no greater nerve to slay than to cure. She had had that matter out with herself, and had settled it to her own satisfaction. "You will have to put off your trip to Monte Carlo," she said as he drank the brandy greedily. "We've lost everything now," he stuttered. "Everything." "This girl has no relations," said the daughter steadily. "Her heirs at law are ourselves." He put down the glass and looked at her, and became almost immediately his old self. "My dear," he said admiringly, "you are really wonderful. Of course, it was childish of me. Now, what do you suggest?" "Unlock that door," she said in a low voice. "I want to call the maid." As he walked to the door, she pressed the footbell, and soon after the faded woman who attended her came into the room. "Hart," she said, "I want you to find my emerald ring, the small one, the little pearl necklet, and the diamond scarf pin. Pack them carefully in a box with cotton wool." "Yes, madame," said the woman, and went out. "Now what are you going to do, Jean?" asked her father. "I am returning them to Mrs. Meredith," said the girl coolly. They were presents given to me by her husband, and I feel after this tragic ending of my dream that I can no longer bear the sight of them." "He didn't give you those things, he gave you the chain. Besides, you're throwing away good money." "I know he never gave them to me, and I am not throwing away good money," she said patiently. "Mrs. Meredith will return them, and she will give me an opportunity of throwing a little light upon James Meredith, an opportunity which I very much desire." Later she went up to her pretty little sitting room on the first floor and wrote a letter. "Dear Mrs. Meredith, I am sending you the few trinkets which James gave to me in happier days. They are all that I have of his, and you, as a woman, will realise that whilst the possession of them brings me many unhappy memories, yet they have been a certain comfort to me. I wish I could dispose of memory as easily as I send these to you, for I feel they are really your property. But more do I wish that I could recall and obliterate the occasion which has made Mr. Glover so bitter an enemy of mine. Thinking over the past, I see that I was at fault, but I know that you will sympathize with me when the truth is revealed to you. A young girl, unused to the ways of men, perhaps I attached too much importance to Mr. Glover's attentions and resented them too crudely. In those days I thought it was unpardonable that a man who professed to be poor James's best friend should make love to his fiancée, though I suppose that such things happen and are endured by the modern girl. A man does not readily forgive a woman for making him feel a fool. It is the one unpardonable offence that a girl can commit. Therefore I do not resent his enmity as much as you might think. Believe me, I feel for you very much in these trying days. Let me say again that I hope your future will be bright." She blotted the letter, put it in an envelope and addressed it, and taking down a book from one of the well-stocked shelves, drew her chair to the fire and began reading. Mr. Briggerland came in an hour after, looked over her shoulder at the title and made a sound of disapproval. "I can't understand your liking for that kind of book," he said. The book was one of the 2 volumes of Chronicles of Crime, and she looked up with a smile. "Can't you? It's very easily explained. It is the most encouraging work in my collection. Sit down for a minute. A record of vulgar criminals," he growled. "Their infernal last dying speeches, their processions to Tyburn. Faugh!" She smiled again and looked down at the book. The wide margins were covered with pencilled notes in her writing. "They're a splendid mental exercise," she said. "In every case I have written down how the criminal might have escaped arrest, but they were all so vulgar and so stupid. Really, the police of the time deserve no credit for catching them. It is the same with modern criminals." She went to the shelf and took down 2 large scrapbooks, carried them across to the fire, and opened one on her knees. "Vulgar and stupid, every one of them," she repeated as she turned the leaves rapidly. "The clever ones get caught at times," said Briggerland gloomily. "Never," she said, and closed the book with a snap. "In England, in France, in America, and in almost every civilized country there are murderers walking about to-day, respected by their fellow citizens. Murderers of whose crimes the police are ignorant. Look at these." She opened the book again. "Here is the case of Vrell, who poisons a troublesome creditor with weed killer. Everybody in the town knew he bought the weed killer. Everybody knew that he was in debt to this man. What chance had he of escaping? Here's Jewelville. He kills his wife, buries her in the cellar, and then calls attention to himself by running away. Here's Morden, who kills his sister-in-law for the sake of her insurance money, and who also buys the poison in broad daylight, and is found with a bottle in his pocket. Such people deserve hanging." "I wish to heaven you wouldn't talk about hanging," said Briggerland tremulously. "You're inhuman, Jean. By God!" "I'm an angel," she smiled, "and I have press cuttings to prove it. The Daily Recorder had half a column on my appearance in the box at Jim's trial." He looked over toward the writing table, saw the letter, and picked it up. "So you've written to the lady. Are you sending her the jewels?" She nodded. He looked at her quickly. "You haven't been up to any funny business with them, have you?" he asked suspiciously, and she smiled. "My dear parent," drawled Jean Briggerland, "after my lecture on the stupidity of the average criminal, do you imagine I should do anything so gauche?" The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 8. "And now, Mrs. Meredith," said Jack Glover, "what are you going to do?" He had spent the greater part of the morning with the new heiress, and Lydia had listened, speechless, as he recited a long and meaningless list of securities, of estates, of ground rents, balances, and the like, which she had inherited. "What am I going to do?" she said, shaking her head hopelessly. "I don't know. I haven't the slightest idea, Mr. Glover. It is so bewildering. Do I understand that all this property is mine?" "Not yet," said Jack with a smile, "but it is so much yours that on the strength of the will we are willing to advance you money to almost any extent. The will has to be proved and probate must be taken, but when these legal formalities are settled and we have paid the very heavy death duties, you will be entitled to dispose of your fortune as you wish. As a matter of fact," he added, "you could do that now. At any rate, you cannot live here in Brinksome Street, and I have taken the liberty of hiring a furnished flat on your behalf. One of our clients has gone away to the Continent and left the flat for me to dispose of. The rent is very low, about 20 guineas a week." "20 guineas a week?" gasped the horrified girl. "Why, I can't—" And then she realized that she could. 20 guineas a week was as nothing to her. This fact, more than anything else, brought her to an understanding of her fortune. "I suppose I had better move," she said dubiously. "Mrs. Morgan is giving up this house, and she asked me whether I had any plans. I think she'd be willing to come as my housekeeper." "Excellent," nodded Jack. "You'll want a maid as well, and of course you will have to put up Jaggs for the nights." "Jaggs?" she said in astonishment. "Jaggs," repeated Jack solemnly. "You see, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Meredith, I'm rather concerned about you, and I want you to have somebody on hand I can rely on, sleeping in your flat at night. I dare say you think I am an old woman," he said as he saw her smile, "and that my fears are groundless, but you will agree that your own experience of last week will support the theory that anything may happen in London. But really, Mr. Glover, you don't mean that I'm in any serious danger? From whom?" "From a lot of people," he said diplomatically. "From poor Miss Briggerland?" she challenged, and his eyes narrowed. "Poor Miss Briggerland," he said softly. "She certainly is poorer than she expected to be." "Nonsense," scoffed the girl. She was irritated, which was unusual in her. "My dear Mr. Glover, why do you pursue your vendetta against her? Do you think it is playing the game honestly now? Isn't it a case of wounded vanity on your part?" He stared at her in astonishment. "Wounded vanity? Do you mean pique?" She nodded. "Why should I be piqued?" he said slowly. "You know best," replied Lydia, and then a light dawned on him. "Have I been making love to Miss Briggerland by any chance?" he asked. "You know best," she repeated. "Good Lord!" And then he began to laugh, and she thought he would never stop. "I suppose I made love to her, and she was angry because I dared to commit such an act of treachery to her fiancé. Yes, that was it. I made love to her behind poor Jim's back, and she ticked me off, and that's why I'm so annoyed with her." "You have a very good memory," said Lydia with a scornful little smile. "My memory isn't as good as Miss Briggerland's power of invention," said Jack. "Doesn't it strike you, Mrs. Meredith, that if I had made love to that young lady I should not be seen here to-day?" "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean," said Jack Glover soberly, "that it would not have been Bulford, but I who would have been lured from his club by a telephone message and told to wait outside the door in Berkeley Street. It would have been I who would have been shot dead by Miss Briggerland's father from the drawing-room window." The girl looked at him in amazement. "What a preposterous charge to make!" she said at last indignantly. "Do you suggest that this girl has connived at a murder?" "I not only suggest that she connived at it, but I stake my life that she planned it," said Jack carefully. "But the pistol was found near Mr. Bulford's body," said Lydia almost triumphantly, as she conceived this unanswerable argument. Jack nodded. From Bulford's body to the drawing-room window was exactly 9 feet. It was possible to pitch the pistol so that it fell near him. Bulford was waiting there by the instructions of Jean Briggerland. We have traced the telephone call that came through to him from the club. It came from the Briggerlands' house in Berkeley Street, and the attendant at the club was sure it was a woman's voice. We didn't find that out till after the trial. Poor Meredith was in the hall when the shot was fired. The signal was given when he turned the handle to let himself out. He heard the shot, rushed down the steps, and saw the body. Whether he picked up the pistol or not, I do not know. Jean Briggerland swears he had it in his hand, but of course Jean Briggerland is a hopeless liar." "You can't know what you're saying," said Lydia in a low voice. "It's a dreadful charge to make, dreadful, against a girl whose very face refutes such an accusation." "Her face is her fortune," snapped Jack, and then penitently, "I'm sorry I'm rude, but somehow the very mention of Jean Briggerland arouses all that is worst in me. Now, you will accept Jaggs, won't you?" "Who is he?" she asked. "He's an old army pensioner. A weird bird, as shrewd as the dickens. In spite of his age, a pretty powerful old fellow." "Oh, he's old," she said with some relief. "He's old, and in some ways incapacitated. He hasn't the use of his right arm, and he's a bit groggy in one of his ankles as a result of a Boer bullet." She laughed in spite of herself. "He doesn't sound a very attractive kind of guardian. He's a perfectly clean old bird, though. I confess he doesn't look it, and he won't bother you or your servants. You can give him a room where he can sit, and you can give him a bit of bread and cheese and a glass of beer, and he'll not bother you." Lydia was amused now. It was absurd that Jack Glover should imagine she needed a guardian at all, but if he insisted, as he did, it will be better to have somebody as harmless as the unattractive Jaggs. "What time will he come?" "About 10 o'clock every night, and he'll leave you at about 7 in the morning. Unless you wish, you need never see him," said Jack. "How did you come to know him?" she asked curiously. "I know everybody," said the boastful young man. "You mustn't forget that I am a lawyer and have to meet very queer people." He gathered up his papers and put them into his little bag. "And now, what are your plans for to-day?" he demanded. She resented the self-imposed guardianship which he had undertaken, yet she could not forget what she owed him. By some extraordinary means he had kept her out of the Meredith case, and she had not been called as a witness at the inquest. Incidentally, in as mysterious a way, he had managed to whitewash his partner and himself. Although the Law Society were holding an inquiry of their own, this the girl did not know, it seemed likely that he would escape the consequence of an act which was a flagrant breach of the law. "I am going to Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's to tea," she said. "Mrs. Cole-Mortimer?" he said quickly. "How do you come to know that lady?" "Really, Mr. Glover, you are almost impertinent." She smiled in spite of her annoyance. "She came to call on me 2 or 3 days after that dreadful morning. She knew Mr. Meredith and was an old friend of the family's." "As a matter of fact," said Jack icily, She did not know Meredith except to say how do you do to him, and she was certainly not a friend of the family. She is, however, a friend of Jean Briggerland." "Jean Briggerland," said the exasperated girl. "Can't you forget her? You are like the man in Dickens's book. She's your King Charles head. Really, for a respectable and a responsible lawyer, you're simply eaten up with prejudices. Of course she was a friend of Mr. Meredith's. Why, she brought me a photograph of him taken when he was at Eton." "Supplied by Jean Briggerland," said the unperturbed Jack calmly. "And if she'd brought you a pair of socks he wore when he was a baby, I suppose you would have accepted those too." "Now you are being really abominable," said the girl, "and I've got a lot to do. Don't forget you can move into Cavendish Mansions tomorrow. I'll send the key round, and the day you move in Jaggs will turn up for duty, bright and smiling. He doesn't talk a great deal. I don't suppose you ever give the poor man a chance," she said cuttingly. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 9. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was a representative of a numerous class of women who lived so close to the border line which separates good society from society which is not quite as good, that the members of either set thought she was in the other. She had a small house where she gave big parties, and nobody quite knew how this widow of an Indian colonel made both ends meet. It was the fact that her menage was an expensive one to maintain. She had a car, she entertained in London in the season, and disappeared from the metropolis when it was the correct thing to disappear, a season of exile which comes between the Goodwood race meeting in the south and the Doncaster race meeting in the north. Lydia had been surprised to receive a visit from this elegant lady, and had readily accepted the story of her friendship with James Meredith. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's invitation she had welcomed. She needed some distraction, something which would smooth out the ravelled threads of life which were now even more tangled than she had ever expected they could be. Mr. Rennett had handed to her £1,000 the day after the wedding, and, when she had recovered from the shock of possessing such a large sum, she hired a taxicab and indulged herself in a wild orgy of shopping. The relief she experienced when he informed her he was taking charge of her affairs and settling the debts which had worried her for 3 years was so great that she felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted from her heart. It was in one of her new frocks that Lydia, feeling more confident than usual, made her call. She had expected to find a crowd at the house in Hyde Park Crescent, and she was surprised when she was ushered into the drawing-room to find only 4 people present. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was a chirpy, pale little woman of 40-something. It would be ungallant to say how much that something represented. She came toward Lydia with outstretched hands. "My dear," she said with extravagant pleasure, "I am glad you were able to come. You know Miss Briggerland and Mr. Briggerland." Lydia looked up at the tall figure of the man she had seen in the stalls the night before her wedding and recognized him instantly. "Mr. Marcus Stepney, I don't think you have met." Lydia bowed to a smart-looking man of 30, immaculately attired. He was very handsome, she thought, in a dark way, but he was just a little too new to please her. She did not like fashion plate men, and although the most captious of critics could not have found fault with his correct attire, he gave her the impression of being overdressed. Lydia had not expected to meet Miss Briggerland and her father, although she had a dim recollection that Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had mentioned her name. Then, in a flash, she recalled the suspicions of Jack Glover, which she had covered with ridicule. The association made her feel a little uncomfortable, and Jean Briggerland, whose intuition was a little short of uncanny, must have read the doubt in her face. "Mrs. Meredith expected to see us, didn't she, Margaret?" she said, addressing the twittering hostess. "Surely you told her we were great friends." "Of course I did, my dear. Knowing your dear cousin and his dear father, it is not remarkable that I should know the whole of the family." and she smiled wisely from one to the other. Of course. How absurd she was, thought Lydia. She had almost forgotten, and probably Jack Glover had forgotten too, that the Briggerlands and the Merediths were related. She found herself talking in a corner of the room with the girl and fell to studying her face anew. A closer inspection merely consolidated her earlier judgment. She smiled inwardly as she remembered Jack Glover's ridiculous warning. It was like killing a butterfly with a steam hammer to loose so much vengeance against this frail piece of china. "And how do you feel now that you're very rich?" asked Jean kindly. "I haven't realized it yet," smiled Lydia. Jean nodded. "I suppose you have yet to settle with the lawyers. Who are they?" "Oh, yes, of course Mr. Glover was poor Jim's solicitor." She sighed. "I dislike lawyers," she said with a shiver. "They are so heavily paternal. They feel that they and they only are qualified to direct your life and your actions. I suppose it is second nature with them. Then, of course, they make an awful lot of money out of commissions and fees, though I'm sure Jack Glover wouldn't worry about that. He's really a nice boy," she said earnestly, "and I don't think you could have a better friend." Lydia glowed at the generosity of this girl whom the man had so maligned. "He has been very good to me," she said, "although, of course, he is a little fussy." Jean's lips twitched with amusement. "Has he warned you against me?" she asked solemnly. "Has he told you what a terrible ogre I am?" And then, without waiting for a reply, "I sometimes think poor Jack is just a little, well, I wouldn't say mad, but a little queer. His dislikes are so violent. He positively loathes Margaret, though why, I have never been able to understand." "He doesn't hate me," laughed Lydia, and Jean looked at her strangely. "No, I suppose not," she said. "I can't imagine anybody hating you, Lydia. May I call you by your Christian name?" "I wish you would," said Lydia warmly. "I can't imagine anybody hating you," repeated the girl thoughtfully. "And of course Jack wouldn't hate you because you're his client, a very rich and attractive client too, my dear." She tapped the girl's cheek, and Lydia for some reason felt foolish. But as though unconscious of the embarrassment she had caused, Jean went on. "I don't really blame him either. I've a shrewd suspicion that all these warnings against me and against other possible enemies will furnish a very excellent excuse for seeing you every day and acting as your personal bodyguard." Lydia shook her head. "That part of it he has relegated already," she said, giving smile for smile. "He has appointed Mr. Jaggs as my bodyguard." "Mr. Jaggs?" The tone was even, the note of inquiry was not strained. "He's an old gentleman in whom Mr. Glover is interested, an old army pensioner. Beyond the fact that he hasn't the use of his right arm, and limps with his left leg, and that he likes beer and cheese, he seems an admirable watchdog," said Lydia humorously. "Jaggs," repeated the girl. "I wonder where I've heard that name before. Is he a detective?" "No, I don't think so. But Mr. Glover thinks I ought to have some sort of man sleeping in my new flat, and Jaggs was duly engaged." Soon after this Mr. Marcus Stepney came over, and Lydia found him rather uninteresting. Less boring was Briggerland, for he had a fund of stories and experiences to relate, and he had, too, one of those soft, soothing voices that are so rare in men. It was dark when she came out with Mr. and Miss Briggerland, and she felt that the afternoon had not been unprofitably spent, for she had a clearer conception of the girl's character, and was getting Jack Glover's interest into better perspective. The mercenary part of it made her just a little sick. There was something so mysterious, so ugly in his outlook on life, and there might not be a little self-interest in his care for her. She stood on the step of the house talking to the girl, whilst Mr. Briggerland lit a cigarette with a patent lighter. Hyde Park Crescent was deserted, save for a man who stood near the railings which protected the area of Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's house. He was apparently tying his shoelaces. They went down on the sidewalk, and Mr. Briggerland looked for his car. "I'd like to take you home. My chauffeur promised to be here at 4 o'clock. These men are most untrustworthy." From the other end of the crescent appeared the lights of a car. At first Lydia thought it might be Mr. Briggerland's, and she was going to make her excuses, for she wanted to go home alone. The car was coming, too, at a tremendous pace. She watched it as it came furiously toward her, and she did not notice that Mr. Briggerland and his daughter had left her standing alone on the sidewalk and had withdrawn a few paces. Suddenly the car made a swerve, mounted the sidewalk, and dashed upon her. It seemed that nothing could save her, and she stood fascinated with horror, waiting for death. Then an arm gripped her waist, a powerful arm that lifted her from her feet and flung her back against the railings as the car flashed past, the mud guard missing her by an inch. The machine pulled up with a jerk, and the white-faced girl saw Briggerland and Jean running toward her. "I should never have forgiven myself if anything had happened. I think my chauffeur must be drunk," said Briggerland in an agitated voice. She had no words. She could only nod, and then she remembered her preserver, and she turned to meet the solemn eyes of a bent old man, whose pointed white beard and bristling white eyebrows gave him a hawk-like appearance. His right hand was thrust into his pocket. He was touching his battered hat with the other. "Beg pardon, miss," he said raucously. "Name of Jaggs, and I have reported for duty." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 10. Jack Glover listened gravely to the story which the girl told. He had called at her lodgings on the following morning to secure her signature to some documents, and breathlessly and a little shamefacedly she told him what had happened. Of course it was an accident, she insisted. In fact, Mr. and Miss Briggerland were almost knocked down by the car. But you don't know how thankful I am your Mr. Jaggs was on the spot. "Where is he now?" asked Jack. "I don't know," replied the girl. "He just limped away without another word, and I did not see him again, though I thought I caught a glimpse of him as I came into this house last night." "How did he come to be on the spot?" she asked curiously. "That is easily explained," replied Jack. "I told the old boy not to let you out of his sight from sundown to sunup." "Then you think I'm safe during the day?" she rallied him. He nodded. "I don't know whether to laugh at you or to be very angry," she said, shaking her head reprovingly. "Of course it was an accident." "I disagree with you," said Jack. "Did you catch a glimpse of the chauffeur?" "No," she said in surprise. "I didn't think of looking at him." He nodded. "If you had, you would probably have seen an old friend, namely, the gentleman who carried you off from the Irving Theatre," he said quietly. It was difficult for Lydia to analyze her own feelings. She knew that Jack Glover was wrong, monstrously wrong. She was perfectly confident that his fantastic theory had no foundation, and yet she could not get away from his sincerity. Remembering Jean's description of him as "a little queer," she tried to fit that description into her knowledge of him, only to admit to herself that he had been exceptionally normal as far as she was concerned. The suggestion that his object was mercenary, and that he looked upon her as a profitable match for himself, she dismissed without consideration. "Anyway, I like your Mr. Jaggs," she said. "Better than you like me, I gather from your tone," smiled Jack. "He's not a bad old boy." "He's a very strong old boy," she said. "He lifted me as though I were a feather. I don't know how I escaped. The steering gear went wrong," she explained unnecessarily. "Dear me," said Jack politely, "and it went right again in time to enable the chauffeur to keep clear of Briggerland and his angel daughter." She gave a gesture of despair. "You're hopeless," she said. "These things happened in the Dark Ages. Men and women do not assassinate one another in the 20th century." "Who told you that?" he demanded. "Human nature hasn't changed for 2,000 years. The instinct to kill is as strong as ever, or wars would be impossible. If any man or woman could commit one cold-blooded murder, there is no reason why he or she should not commit 100. In England, America, and France, 50 cold-blooded murders are detected every year. Twice that number are undetected. It does not make the crime more impossible because the criminal is good-looking." "You're hopeless," she said again, and Jack made no further attempt to convince her. On the Thursday of that week she exchanged her lodgings for a handsome flat in Cavendish Place, and Mrs. Morgan had promised to join her a week later, when she had settled up her own business affairs. Lydia was fortunate enough to get 2 maids from one of the agencies, one of whom was to sleep on the premises. The flat was not illimitable, and she regretted that she had promised to place a room at the disposal of the aged Mr. Jaggs. If he was awake all night, as she presumed he would be, and slept in the day, he might have been accommodated in the kitchen, and she hinted as much to Jack. To her surprise, the lawyer had turned down that idea. "You don't want your servants to know that you have a watchman?" "What do you imagine they will think he is?" she asked scornfully. "How can I have an old gentleman in the flat without explaining why he is there? Your explanation could be that he did the boots." "It wouldn't take him all night to do the boots. Of course I'm too grateful to him to want him to do anything." Mr. Jaggs reported again for duty that night. He came at 9:30, a shabby-looking old man, and Lydia, who had not yet got used to her new magnificence, came out into the hall to meet him. He was certainly not a prepossessing object, and Lydia discovered that, in addition to his other misfortunes, he had a slight squint. "I hadn't an opportunity of thanking you the other day, Mr. Jaggs," she said. "I think you saved my life." "That's all right, miss," he said in his hoarse voice. "Duty is duty." She thought he was looking past her, till she realized that his curious slanting line of vision was part of his infirmity. "I'll show you to your room," she said hastily. She led the way down the corridor, opened the door of a small room which had been prepared for him, and switched on the light. "Too much light for me, miss," said the old man, shaking his head. "I like to sit in the dark and listen, that's what I like. To sit in the dark and listen." "But you can't sit in the dark. You'll want to read, won't you?" "Can't read, miss," said Jaggs cheerfully. "Can't write either. I don't know that I'm any worse off." Reluctantly she switched out the light. "But you won't be able to see your food." "I can feel for that, miss," he said with a hoarse chuckle. "Don't you worry about me. I'll just sit here and have a big think." If she was uncomfortable before, she was really embarrassed now. The very sight of the door behind which old Jaggs sat having his "big think" was an irritation to her. She could not sleep for a long time that night for thinking of him sitting in the darkness and "listening," as he put it, and had firmly resolved on ending a condition of affairs which was particularly distasteful to her when she fell asleep. She woke when the maid brought her tea, to learn that Jaggs had gone. The maid, too, had her views on the old gentleman. She hadn't slept all night for the thought of him, she said, though probably this was an exaggeration. The arrangement must end, thought Lydia, and she called at Jack Glover's office that afternoon to tell him so. Jack listened without comment until she had finished. "I'm sorry he is worrying you, but you'll get used to him in time, and I should be obliged if you kept him for a month. You would relieve me of a lot of anxiety." At first she was determined to have her way, but he was so persistent, so pleading, that eventually she surrendered. Lucy, the new maid, however, was not so easily convinced. "I don't like it, miss," she said. "He's just like an old tramp, and I'm sure we shall be murdered in our beds." "How cheerful you are, Lucy," laughed Lydia. "Of course there is no danger from Mr. Jaggs, and he really was very useful to me." The girl grumbled and assented a little sulkily, and Lydia had a feeling that she was going to lose a good servant. In this she was not mistaken. Old Jaggs called at 9:30 that night, and was admitted by the maid, who stalked in front of him and opened his door. "There's your room," she snapped, "and I'd rather have your room than your company." "Would you, miss?" wheezed Jaggs, and Lydia, attracted by the sound of voices, came to the door and listened with some amusement. "Lord bless me life, it ain't a bad room either. Put the light out, my dear, I don't like light. I like 'em dark, like them little cells in Holloway prison where you were took 2 years ago for robbing your missus." Lydia's smile left her face. She heard the girl gasp. "You old liar!" she hissed. "Lucy Jones, you call yourself. You used to be Mary Welch in them days," chuckled old Jaggs. "I'm not going to be insulted!" almost screamed Lucy, though there was a note of fear in her strident voice. "I'm going to leave tonight." "No, you ain't, my dear," said old Jaggs complacently. "You're going to sleep here tonight, and you're going to leave in the morning. If you try to get out of that door before I let you, you'll be pinched." "They've got nothing against me," the girl was betrayed into saying. "False characters, my dear. Pretending to come from the agency when you didn't. That's another crime. Lord bless your heart, I got enough against you to put you in jail for a year." Lydia came forward. "What is this you're saying about my maid?" "Good evening, ma'am." The old man knuckled his forehead. "I'm just having an argument with your young lady." "Did you say she's a thief?" "Of course she is, miss," said Jaggs scornfully. "You ask her." But Lucy had gone into her room, slammed the door and locked it. The next morning, when Lydia woke, the flat was empty, save for herself, but she had hardly finished dressing when there came a knock at the door, and a trim, fresh-looking country girl, with an expansive smile and a look of good cheer that warmed Lydia's heart, appeared. "You're the lady that wants a maid, ma'am, aren't you?" "Yes," said Lydia in surprise, "but who sent you?" "I was telegraphed for yesterday, ma'am, from the country." "Come in," said Lydia helplessly. "Isn't it right?" asked the girl a little disappointedly. "They sent me my fare. I came up by the first train." "It is quite all right," said Lydia, "only I'm wondering who is running this flat, me or Mr. Jaggs." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 11. Jean Briggerland had spent a very busy afternoon. There had been a string of callers at the handsome house in Berkeley Street. Mr. Briggerland was of a philanthropic bent, and had instituted a club in the East End of London which was intended to raise the moral tone of Limehouse, Wapping, Poplar, and the adjacent districts. It was started without ostentation, with a man named Fair as general manager. Mr. Fair had had in his lifetime several hectic contests with the police, in which he had been invariably the loser, and it was in his role as a reformed character that he undertook the management of this social uplift club. Well-meaning police officials had warned Mr. Briggerland that Fair had a bad character. Mr. Briggerland listened, was grateful for the warning, but explained that Fair had come under the influence of the new uplift movement, and from henceforward he would be an exemplary citizen. Later, the police had occasion to extend their warning to its founder. The club was being used by known criminal characters, men who had already been in jail and were qualifying for a return visit. Again Mr. Briggerland pointed to the object of the institution, which was to bring bad men into the society of good men and women, and to arouse in them a desire for better things. He quoted a famous text with great effect, but still the police were unconvinced. It was the practice of Miss Jean Briggerland to receive selected members of the club and to entertain them at tea in Berkeley Street. Her friends thought it was very sweet and very daring, and wondered whether she wasn't afraid of catching some kind of disease peculiar to the East End of London. But Jean did not worry about such things. On this afternoon, after the last of her callers had gone, she went down to the little morning room where such entertainments occurred, and found two men who rose awkwardly as she entered. The gentle influence of the club had not made them look anything but what they were. Jailbird was written all over them. "I'm very glad you men have come," said Jean sweetly. "Mr. Hoggins?" "That's me, miss," said one with a grin. "And Mr. Talmot?" The second man showed his teeth. "I'm always glad to see members of the club," said Jean, busy with the teapot. "Especially men who have had so bad a time as you have. You have only just come out of prison, haven't you, Mr. Hoggins?" she asked innocently. Hoggins went red and coughed. "Yes, miss," he said huskily, and added inconsequently, "I didn't do it." "I'm sure you were innocent," she said with a smile of sympathy. "And really, if you were guilty, I don't think you men are so much to blame. Look what a bad time you have. What disadvantages you suffer, whilst here in the West End people are wasting money that really ought to go to your wives and children." "That's right," said Mr. Hoggins. "There's a girl I know who is tremendously rich," Jean prattled on. "She lives at 84 Cavendish Mansions, just on the top floor, and of course she's very foolish to sleep with her windows open, especially as people could get down from the roof. There's a fire escape there. She always has a lot of jewellery, keeps it under her pillow, I think, and there is generally a few £100 scattered about the bedroom. Now that is what I call putting temptation in the way of the weak." She lifted her blue eyes, saw the glitter in the man's eyes, and went on. "I've told her lots of times that there is danger, but she only laughs. There is an old man who sleeps in the house, quite a feeble old man who has only the use of one arm. Of course, if she cried out, I suppose he would come to her rescue, but then a real burglar wouldn't let her cry out, would he?" she asked. The two men looked at one another. "No," breathed one. "Especially as they could get clean away if they were clever," said Jean, "and it isn't likely that they would leave her in a condition to betray them, is it?" Mr. Hoggins cleared his throat. "It's not very likely, miss," he said. Jean shrugged her shoulders. "Women do these things, and then they blame the poor man to whom £1,000 would be a fortune, because he comes and takes it. Personally, I should not like to live at 84 Cavendish Mansions." "84 Cavendish Mansions," murmured Mr. Hoggins absent-mindedly. His last sentence had been one of 10 years' penal servitude. His next sentence would be for life. Nobody knew this better than Jean Briggerland as she went on to talk of the club and of the wonderful work which it was doing. She dismissed her visitors and went back to her sitting room. As she turned to go up the stairway, her maid intercepted her. "Mary is in your room, miss," she said in a low voice. Jean frowned, but made no reply. The woman who stood awkwardly in the centre of the room awaiting the girl greeted her with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, miss," she said, "but I lost my job this morning. That old man spotted me. He's a split, a detective." Jean Briggerland regarded her with an unmoved face, save that her beautiful mouth took on the pathetic little droop which had excited the pity of a judge and an army of lawyers. "When did this happen?" she asked. "Last night, miss. He came, and I got a bit cheeky to him, and he turned on me, the old devil, and told me my real name, and that I got the job by forging recommendations." Jean sat down slowly in the padded Venetian chair before her writing table. "Jaggs?" she asked. "Yes, miss." "And why didn't you come here at once?" "I thought I might be followed, miss." The girl bit her lip and nodded. "You did quite right," she said, and then, after a moment's reflection, "We shall be in Paris next week. You had better go by the night train and wait for us at the flat." She gave the maid some money, and after she had gone, sat for an hour before the fire, looking into its red depths. She rose at last, a little stiffly, pulled the heavy silken curtain across the windows and switched on the light, and there was a smile on her face that was very beautiful to see, for in that hour came an inspiration. She sought her father in his study and told him her plan, and he blanched and shivered with the very horror of it. The Angel of Terror, by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 12. Mr. Briggerland, it seemed, had some other object in life than the regeneration of the criminal classes. He was a sociologist, a loose title which covers a great deal of inquisitive investigation into other people's affairs. Moreover, he had published a book on the subject. His name was on the title page, and the book had been reviewed to his credit, though in truth he did no more than suggest the title, the work in question having been carried out by a writer on the subject who, for a consideration, had allowed Mr. Briggerland to adopt the child of his brain. On a morning when pale yellow sunlight brightened his dining room, Mr. Briggerland put down his newspaper and looked across the table at his daughter. He had a club in the East End of London, and his manager had telephoned that morning, sending a somewhat unhappy report. "Do you remember that man Talmot, my dear?" he asked. She nodded and looked up quickly. "Yes, what about him?" "He's in hospital," said Mr. Briggerland. "I fear that he and Hoggins were engaged in some nefarious plan, and that in making an attempt to enter, as of course they had no right to enter, a block of flats in Cavendish Place, poor Talmot slipped and fell from the fourth floor window sill, breaking his leg. Hoggins had to carry him to hospital." The girl reached for bacon from the hot plate. "He should have broken his neck," she said calmly. "I suppose now the police are making tender inquiries." "No, no," Mr. Briggerland hastened to assure her. "Nobody knows anything about it, not even the fortunate occupant of the flat they were evidently trying to burgle. I only learned of it because the manager of the club, who gets information of this character, thought I would be interested." "Anyway, I'm glad they didn't succeed," said Jean after a while. "The possibility of their trying rather worried me. The Hoggins type is such a bungler that it was almost certain they would fail." It was a curious fact that whilst her father made the most guarded references to all their exploits and clothed them with garments of euphemism, his daughter never attempted any such disguise. The psychologist would find in Mr. Briggerland's reticence the embryo of a once dominant rectitude, no trace of which remained in his daughter's moral equipment. "I have been trying to place this man Jaggs," she went on with a little puzzled frown, "and he completely baffles me. He arrives every night in a taxicab, sometimes from St. Pancras, sometimes from Euston, sometimes from London Bridge Station." "Do you think he is a detective?" "I don't know," she said thoughtfully. "If he is, he has been imported from the provinces. He is not a Scotland Yard man. He may, of course, be an old police pensioner, and I have been trying to trace him from that source." "It should not be difficult to find out all about him," said Mr. Briggerland easily. "A man with his afflictions should be pretty well known." He looked at his watch. "My appointment at Norwood is at 11 o'clock," he said. He made a little grimace of disgust. "Would you rather I went?" asked the girl. Mr. Briggerland would much rather that she had undertaken the disagreeable experience which lay before him, but he dare not confess as much. "You, my dear? Of course not. I would not allow you to have such an experience. No, no, I don't mind it a bit." Nevertheless, he tossed down 2 long glasses of brandy before he left. His car set him down before the iron gates of a squat and ugly stucco building, surrounded by high walls, and the uniformed attendant, having examined his credentials, admitted him. He had to wait a little while before a second attendant arrived to conduct him to the medical superintendent, an elderly man who did not seem overwhelmed with joy at the honour Mr. Briggerland was paying him. "I'm sorry I shan't be able to show you round, Mr. Briggerland," he said. "I have an engagement in town, but my assistant, Dr. Carew, will conduct you over the asylum and give you all the information you require. This, of course, as you know, is a private institution. I should have thought you would have got more material for your book in one of the big public asylums. The people who are sent to Norwood, you know, are not the mild cases, and you will see some rather terrible sights. You are prepared for that?" Mr. Briggerland nodded. He was prepared, to the extent of 2 full noggins of brandy. Moreover, he was well aware that Norwood was the asylum to which the more dangerous of lunatics were transferred. Dr. Carew proved to be a young and enthusiastic alienist, whose heart and soul was in his work. "I suppose you are prepared to see jumpy things," he said with a smile as he conducted Mr. Briggerland along a stone vaulted corridor. He opened a steel gate, the bars of which were encased with thick layers of rubber, crossed a grassy plot, there were no stone flagged paths at Norwood, and entered one of the 3 buildings which constituted the asylum proper. It was a harrowing, heart-breaking, and to some extent a disappointing experience for Mr. Briggerland. True, his heart did not break, because it was made of infrangible material, and his disappointment was counterbalanced by a certain vague relief. At the end of 2 hours' inspection they were standing out in the big playing fields, watching the less violent of the patients wandering aimlessly about. Except one, they were unattended by keepers, but in the case of this one man 2 stalwart uniformed men walked on either side of him. "Who is he?" asked Briggerland. "That is rather a sad case," said the alienist cheerfully. He had pointed out many sad cases in the same bright manner. "He's a doctor and a genuine homicide. Luckily they detected him before he did any mischief, or he would have been in Broadmoor." "Aren't you ever afraid of these men escaping?" asked Mr. Briggerland. "You asked that before," said the doctor in surprise. "No. You see, an insane asylum is not like a prison. To make a good get away from prison you have to have outside assistance. Nobody wants to help a lunatic escape. Otherwise it would be easier than getting out of prison, because we have no patrols in the grounds. The wards can be opened from the outside without a key, and the night patrol who visits the wards every half hour has no time for any other observation. Would you like to talk to Dr. Thun?" Mr. Briggerland hesitated only for a second. "Yes," he said huskily. There was nothing in the appearance of the patient to suggest that he was in any way dangerous. A fair, bearded man with pale blue eyes, he held out his hand impulsively to the visitor, and after a momentary hesitation Mr. Briggerland took it and found his hand in a grip like a vice. The 2 attendants exchanged glances with the asylum doctor and strolled off. "I think you can talk to him without fear," said the doctor in a low voice. Not so low, however, that the patient did not hear it, for he laughed. "Without fear, favour, or prejudice, eh? Yes, that was how they swore the officers at my court-martial." The doctor was the general who was responsible for the losses at Caporetto, explained Dr. Carew. That was where the Italians lost so heavily. Thun nodded. Of course, I was perfectly innocent, he explained to Briggerland seriously, and taking the visitor's arm, he strolled across the field, the doctor and the two attendants following at a distance. Mr. Briggerland breathed a little more quickly as he felt the strength of the patient's biceps. My conviction, said Dr. Thun seriously, was due to the fact that women were sitting on the court-martial, which is, of course, against all regulations. Certainly, murmured Mr. Briggerland. Keeping me here, Thun went on, is part of the plot of the Italian government. Naturally, they do not wish me to get at my enemies, who I have every reason to believe are in London. Mr. Briggerland drew a long breath. They are in London, he said a little hoarsely. I happen to know where they are. Really? Said the other easily, and then a cloud passed over his face and he shook his head. They are safe from my vengeance, he said a little sadly. As long as they keep me in this place pretending that I am mad, there is no possible chance for me. The visitor looked round and saw that the three men who were following were out of earshot. Suppose I came tomorrow night, he said, lowering his voice, and helped you to get away. What is your ward? Number 6, said the other in the same tone. His eyes were blazing. Do you think you will remember? Asked Briggerland. Thun nodded. You will come tomorrow night? Number 6, the first cubicle on the left, he whispered. You will not fail me. If I thought you'd fail me. His eyes lit up again. I shall not fail you, said Mr. Briggerland hastily. When the clock strikes 12, you may expect me. You must be Marshal Faulk, murmured Thun, and then, with all a madman's cunning, changed the conversation as the doctor and the attendants, who had noticed his excitement, drew nearer. Believe me, Mr. Briggerland, he went on airily, the strategy of the Allies was at fault until I took up command of the army. 10 minutes later, Mr. Briggerland was in his car driving homeward, a little breathless, more than a little terrified at the unpleasant task he had set himself, jubilant, too, at his amazing success. Jean had said he might have to visit a dozen asylums before he found his opportunity and the right man, and he had succeeded at the first attempt. Yet he shuddered at the picture he conjured. That climb over the high wall. He had already located the ward, for he had followed the general and the attendants and had seen him safely put away. The midnight association with a madman. He burst in upon Jean with his news. At the first attempt, my dear. What do you think of that? His dark face glowed with almost childish pride, and she looked at him with a half smile. I thought you would, she said quietly. That's the rough work done, at any rate. The rough work? He said indignantly. She nodded. Half the difficulty is going to be to cover up your visit to the asylum, because this man is certain to mention your name, and it will not all be dismissed as the imagination of a madman. Now, I think I will make my promised call upon Mrs. Meredith. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 13. There was one thing which rather puzzled and almost piqued Lydia Meredith, and that was the failure of Jean Briggerland's prophecy to materialize. Jean had said, half jestingly, that Jack Glover would be a frequent visitor at the flat. In point of fact, he did not come at all. Even when she visited the offices of Rennett, Glover and Simpson, it was Mr. Rennett who attended to her, and Jack was invisible. Mr. Rennett sometimes explained that he was at the courts, for Jack did all the court work. sometimes that he had gone home. She caught a glimpse of him once as she was driving past the law courts in the Strand. He was standing on the pavement, talking to a bewigged counsel, so possibly Mr. Rennett had not stated more than the truth when he said that the young man's time was mostly occupied by the processes of litigation. She was curious enough to look through the telephone directory to discover where he lived. There were about 50 Glovers, and 10 of these were John Glovers, and she was enough of a woman to call up 6 of the most likely, only to discover that her Mr. Glover was not amongst them. She did not know till later that his full name was Bertram John Glover, or she might have found his address without difficulty. Mrs. Morgan had now arrived, to Lydia's infinite relief, and had taken control of the household affairs. The new maid was as perfect as a new maid could be, and but for the nightly intrusion of the taciturn Jaggs, to whom for some reason Mrs. Morgan took a liking, the current of her domestic life ran smoothly. She was already becoming accustomed to the possession of wealth. The habit of being rich is one of the easiest acquired, and she found herself negotiating for a little house in Curzon Street, and a more pretentious establishment in Somerset, with a sang-froid which astonished and frightened her. The purchase and arrival of her first car, and the engagement of her chauffeur had been a thrilling experience. It was incredible, too, that her new bankers should without hesitation deliver to her enormous sums of money at the mere affixing of her signature to an oblong slip of paper. She had even gotten over the panicked feeling which came to her on her first few visits to the bank. On these earlier occasions she had felt rather like an inexpert forger who was endeavouring to get money by false pretence, and it was both a relief and a wonder to her when the nonchalant cashier thrust thick wads of bank notes under the grill without so much as sending for a policeman. "It's a lovely flat," said Jean Briggerland, looking round the pink drawing-room approvingly. "But of course, my dear, this is one that was already furnished for you. I'm dying to see what you will make of your own home when you get one." She had telephoned that morning to Lydia, saying that she was paying a call, asking if it was convenient, and the two girls were alone. "It is a nice flat, and I shall be sorry to leave it," agreed Lydia. "It is so extraordinarily quiet. I sleep like a top. There is no noise to disturb one, except that there was rather an unpleasant happening the other morning." "What was that?" asked Jean, stirring her tea. "I don't know really what happened," said Lydia. "I heard an awful groaning very early in the morning, and I got up and looked out of the window. There were 2 men in the courtyard. One, I think, had hurt himself very badly. I never discovered what happened." "They must have been workmen, I should think," said Jean, "or else they were drunk. Personally, I have never liked taking furnished flats," she went on. "One always breaks things, and there's such a big bill to pay at the end. And then I always lose the keys. One usually has 2 or 3. You should be very careful about that, my dear. They make an enormous charge for lost keys," she prattled on. "I think the house agent gave me 3," said Lydia. She walked to her little secretary, opened it, and pulled out a drawer. "Yes, 3," she said. "There's one here, one I carry, and Mrs. Morgan has one. Have you seen Jack Glover lately?" Jean never pursued an inquiry too far by so much as one syllable. "No, I haven't seen him," smiled Lydia. "You weren't a good prophet." "I expect he is busy," said the girl carelessly. "I think I could like Jack awfully if he hadn't such a passion for ordering people about. Oh, how careless of me." She had tipped over her teacup, and its contents were running across the little tea table. She pulled out her handkerchief quickly and tried to stop the flow. "Oh, please, please don't spoil your beautiful handkerchief," said Lydia, rising hurriedly. "I'll get a duster." She ran out of the room and was back almost immediately, to find Jean standing with her back to the secretary, examining the ruins of her late handkerchief with a smile. "Let me put your handkerchief in water or it will be stained," said Lydia, putting out her hand. "I would rather do it myself," laughed Jean Briggerland, and pushed the handkerchief into her bag. There were many reasons why Lydia should not handle that flimsy piece of cambric and lace, the most important of which was the key which Jean had taken from the secretary in Lydia's absence and had rolled inside the tea-stained handkerchief. A few days later Mr. Bertram John Glover interviewed a high official at Scotland Yard, and the interview was not a particularly satisfactory one to the lawyer. It might have been worse had not the police commissioner been a friend of Jack's partner. The official listened patiently, whilst the lawyer, with professional skill, marshalled all his facts, attaching to them the suspicions which had matured to convictions. "I have sat in this chair for 25 years," said the head of the C.I.D., "and I have heard stories which beat the best and the worst of detective stories hollow. I have listened to cranks, amateur detectives, crooks, parsons, and expert fictionists, but never in my experience have I heard anything quite so improbable as your theory. It happens that I have met Briggerland, and I've met his daughter too, and a more beautiful girl I don't think it has been my pleasure to meet." Jack groaned. "Aren't you feeling well?" asked the chief unpleasantly. "I'm all right, sir," said Jack, "only I'm so tired of hearing about Jean Briggerland's beauty. It doesn't seem a very good argument to oppose to the facts." "Facts?" said the other scornfully. "What facts have you given us?" "The fact of the Briggerland's history," said Jack desperately. "Briggerland was broke when he married Miss Meredith, under the impression that he would get a fortune with his wife. He has lived by his wits all his life, and until this girl was about 15 they were existing in a state of poverty. They lived in a tiny house in Ealing, the rent of which was always in arrears, and then Briggerland became acquainted with a rich Australian of middle age, who was crazy about his daughter. The rich Australian died suddenly." "From an overdose of veronal," said the chief. "It was established at the inquest I got all the documents out after I received your letter that he was in the habit of taking veronal. You suggest he was murdered. If he was, for what? He left the girl about £6,000. "Briggerland thought she was going to get it all," said Jack. "That is conjecture," interrupted the chief. "Go on." "Briggerland moved up west," Jack went on, "and when the girl was 17 she made the acquaintance of a man named Gunsbury, who went just as mad about her. Gunsbury was a Midland merchant with a wife and family. He was so infatuated with her that he collected all the loose money he could lay his hands on, some £25,000, and bolted to the Continent. The girl was supposed to have gone on ahead, and he was to join her at Calais. He never reached Calais. The theory was that he jumped overboard. His body was found and brought into Dover, but there was none of the money in his possession that he had drawn from the Midland Bank." "That's a theory too," said the chief, shaking his head. "The identity of the girl was never established. It was known that she was a friend of Gunsbury's, but there's no proof that she was in London on the night of his death. It was a clear case of suicide." "A year later," Jack went on, "she forced a meeting with Meredith, her cousin. His father had just died. Jim had come back from Central Africa to put things in order. He was not a woman's man, and was a grave, retiring sort of fellow who had no other interest in life than his shooting. The story of Meredith you know." "And is that all?" asked the chief politely. "All the facts I can gather. There must be other cases which are beyond the power of the investigator to unearth." "And what do you expect me to do?" Jack smiled. "I don't expect you to do anything," he said frankly. You are not exactly supporting my views with enthusiasm." The chief rose, a signal that the interview was at an end. "I'd like to help you if you had any real need for help," he said, "but when you come to me and tell me that Miss Briggerland, a girl whose innocence shows in her face, is a heartless criminal and murderess and a conspirator, why, Mr. Glover, what do you expect me to say?" "I expect you to give adequate protection to Mrs. Meredith," said Jack sharply. "I expect you, sir, to remember that I've warned you that Mrs. Meredith may die one of those accidental deaths in which Mr. and Miss Briggerland specialise. I'm going to put my warning in black and white, and if anything happens to Lydia Meredith, there is going to be serious trouble on the Thames Embankment." The chief touched a bell and a constable came in. "Show Mr. Glover the way out," he said stiffly. Jack had calmed down considerably by the time he reached the Thames Embankment, and was inclined to be annoyed with himself for losing his temper. He stopped a newsboy, took a paper from his hand, and hailing a cab, drove to his office. There was little in the early edition save the sporting news, but on the front page a paragraph arrested his eye. "Dangerous lunatic at large." The medical superintendent at Norwood Asylum reports that Dr. Algernon John Thun, an inmate of the asylum, escaped last night, and is believed to be at large in the neighbourhood. Search parties have been organised, but no trace of the man has been found. He is known to have homicidal tendencies, a fact which renders his immediate recapture a very urgent necessity. There followed a description of the wanted man. Jack turned to another part of the paper and dismissed the paragraph from his mind. His partner, however, was to bring the matter up at lunch. Norwood Asylum was near Dulwich, and Mr. Rennett was pardonably concerned. "The women folk at my house are scared to death," he said at lunch. "They won't go out at night, and they keep all the doors locked. How did your interview with the Commissioner go on?" "We parted the worst of friends," said Jack, "and Rennett, the next man who talks to me about Jean Briggerland's beautiful face, is going to be killed dead through it, even though I have to take a leaf from her book and employ the grisly Jaggs to do it." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 14. That night the grisly Jaggs was later than usual. Lydia heard him shuffling along the passage, and presently the door of his room closed with a click. She was sitting at the piano, and had stopped playing at the sound of his knock, and when Mrs. Morgan came in to announce his arrival, she closed the piano and swung round on the music stool, a look of determination on her delicate face. "He's come, miss." "And for the last time," said Lydia ominously. "Mrs. Morgan, I can't stand that weird old gentleman any longer. He has got on my nerves so that I could scream when I think of him." "He's not a bad old gentleman," excused Mrs. Morgan. "I'm not so worried about his moral character, and I dare say that it is perfectly blameless," said Lydia determinedly, "but I have written a note to Mr. Glover to tell him that I really must dispense with his services." "What's he here for, miss?" asked Mrs. Morgan. Her curiosity had been aroused, but this was the first time she had given it expression. "He's here because—" Lydia hesitated. "Well, because Mr. Glover thinks I ought to have a man in the house to look after me." "Why, miss?" asked the startled woman. "You'd better ask Mr. Glover that question," said Lydia grimly. She was beginning to chafe under the sense of restraint. She was being school-marmed, she thought. No girl likes the ostentatious protection of the big brother or the head mistress. The soul of the schoolgirl yearns to break from the crocodile in which she is marched to church and to school, and this sensation of being marshalled and ordered about, and of living her life according to a third person's programme, and that third person a man, irked her horribly. Old Jaggs was the outward and visible sign of Jack Glover's unwarranted authority, and slowly there was creeping into her mind a suspicion that Jean Briggerland might not have been mistaken when she spoke of Jack's penchant for ordering people about. Life was growing bigger for her. She had broken down the barriers which had confined her to a narrow promenade between office and home. The hours which she had had to devote to work were now entirely free, and she could sketch or paint whenever the fancy took her, which was not very often, though she promised herself a period of hard work when once she was settled down. Toward the good-looking young lawyer her point of view had shifted. She hardly knew herself how she regarded him. He irritated, and yet in some indefinable way pleased her. His sincerity? She did not doubt his sincerity. She admitted to herself that she wished he would call a little more frequently than he did. He might have persuaded her that Jaggs was a necessary evil, but he hadn't even taken the trouble to come. Therefore, but this she did not admit, Jaggs must go. "I don't think the old gentleman's quite right in his head, you know, sometimes," said Mrs. Morgan. "Why ever not, Mrs. Morgan?" asked the girl in surprise. "I often hear him sniggering to himself as I go past his door. I suppose he stays in his room all night, miss?" "He doesn't," said the girl emphatically, "and that's why he's going. I heard him in the passage at 2 o'clock this morning. I'm getting into such a state of nerves that the slightest sound awakens me. He had his boots off and was creeping about in his stockings, and when I went out and switched the light on, he bolted back to his room. I can't have that sort of thing going on, and I won't. It's altogether too creepy." Mrs. Morgan agreed. Lydia had not been out in the evening for several days, she remembered, as she began to undress for the night. The weather had been unpleasant, and to stay in the warm, comfortable flat was no great hardship. Even if she had gone out, Jaggs would have accompanied her, she thought ironically. And then she had a little twinge of conscience, remembering that Jaggs's presence on a memorable afternoon had saved her from destruction. She wondered for the 20th time what was old Jaggs's history, and where Jack had found him. Once she had been tempted to ask Jaggs himself, but the old man had fenced with the question and had talked vaguely of having worked in the country, and she was as wise as she had been before. But she must get rid of old Jaggs, she thought, as she switched off the light and kicked out the innumerable water bottles with which Mrs. Morgan, in mistaken kindness, had encumbered the bed. Old Jaggs must go. He was a nuisance. She woke with a start from a dreamless sleep. The clock in the hall was striking 3. She realized this subconsciously. Her eyes were fixed on the window, which was open at the bottom. Mrs. Morgan had pulled it down at the top, but now it was wide open, and her heart began to thump, thump rapidly. Jaggs! He was her first thought. She would never have believed that she could have thought of that old man with such a warm glow of thankfulness. There was nothing to be seen. The storm of the early night had passed over, and a faint light came into the room from the waning moon, and then she saw the curtains move, and opened her mouth to scream. But fear had paralyzed her voice, and she lay staring at the hangings, incapable of movement or sound. As she watched the curtain, she saw it move again, and a shape appeared faintly against the gloomy background. The spell was broken. She swung herself out of the opposite side of the bed and raced to the door. But the man was before her. Before she could scream, a big hand gripped her throat and flung her back against the rail of the bed. Horrified, she stared into the cruel face that leered down at her and felt the grip tighten. And then, as she looked into the face, she saw a sudden grimace and sensed the terror in his eyes. The hand relaxed. He bubbled something thickly and fell sideways against the bed. And now she saw. A man had come through the doorway, a tall man with a fair beard and eyes that danced with insane joy. He came slowly toward her, wiping on his cuff the long-handled knife that had sent her assailant to the floor. He was mad. She knew it instinctively, and remembered in a hazy, confused way a paragraph she had read about an escaped lunatic. She tried to dash past him to the open door, but he caught her in the crook of his left arm and pressed her to him, towering head and shoulders over her. "You have no right to sit in a court-martial, madam," he said with uncanny politeness, and at that moment the light in the room was switched on and Jaggs appeared in the doorway, his bearded lips parted in an ugly grin, a long-barreled pistol in his left hand. "Drop your knife," he said, "or I'll drop you." The mad doctor turned his head slowly and frowned at the intruder. "Good morning, General," he said calmly. "You came in time," and he threw the knife onto the ground. "We will try her according to regulations." The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 15. A tragic affair in the West End. Mad doctor wounds a burglar in a society woman's bedroom. There was an extraordinary and tragic sequel to the escape of Dr. Thun from Norwood Asylum, particulars of which appeared in our early edition of yesterday. This morning at 4 o'clock, in answer to a telephone call, Detective Sergeant Miller, accompanied by another officer, went to 84 Cavendish Mansions, a flat occupied by Mrs. Meredith, and there found and took into custody Dr. Algernon Thun, who had escaped from Norwood Asylum. In the room was also found a man named Hoggins, a person well known to the police. It appears that Hoggins had effected an entrance into Mrs. Meredith's flat, descending from the roof by means of a rope, making his way into the premises through the window of Mrs. Meredith's bedroom. Whilst there he was detected by Mrs. Meredith, who would undoubtedly have been murdered had not Dr. Thun, who in some mysterious manner had gained admission to the flat, intervened. In the struggle that followed, the doctor, who was suffering from the delusion of persecution, severely wounded the man, who was not expected to live. He then turned his attention to the lady. Happily, an old man who works at the flat, who was sleeping on the premises at the time, was roused by the sound of the struggle, and succeeded in releasing the lady from the maniacal grasp of the intruder. The wounded burglar was removed to hospital, and the lunatic was taken to the police station, and was afterwards sent under a strong guard to the asylum from whence he had escaped. He made a rambling statement to the police to the effect that General Foch had assisted his escape and had directed him to the home of his persecutors. Jean Briggerland put down the paper and laughed. "It is nothing to snigger about," growled Briggerland savagely. "If I didn't laugh, I should do something more emotional," said the girl coolly. "To think that that fool should go back and make the attempt single-handed! I never imagined that." "Fair tells me that he's not expected to live," said Mr. Briggerland. He rubbed his bald head irritably. "I wonder if that lunatic is going to talk." "What does it matter if he does?" said the girl impatiently. "You said the other day," he began. "The other day it mattered, my dear father. To-day nothing matters very much. I think we have got well out of it. I ignored all the lessons which my textbook teaches when I entrusted work to other hands. Jaggs, she said softly. Eh? Said the father. I'm repeating a well-beloved name. She smiled and rose, folding her serviette. I am going for a long run in the country. Would you like to come? Morden is very enthusiastic about the new car, the bill for which, by the way, came in this morning. Have we any money? A few thousands, said her father, rubbing his chin. Jean, we shall have to sell something unless things brighten. Jean's lips twitched, but she said nothing. On her way to the open road she called at Cavendish Mansions, and was neither surprised nor discomfited to discover that Jack Glover was there. "My dear," she said, warmly clasping both the girl's hands in hers, "I was so shocked when I read the news. How terrible it must have been for you." Lydia was looking pale, and there were dark shadows under her eyes, but she treated the matter cheerfully. "I've just been trying to explain to Mr. Glover what happened. Unfortunately, the wonderful Jaggs is not here. He knows more about it than I, for I collapsed in the most feminine way." "How did he get in? I mean, this madman?" asked the girl. "Through the door." It was Jack who answered. "It is the last way in the world a lunatic would enter a flat, isn't it? He came in with a key, and he was brought here by somebody who struck a match to make sure it was the right number." "He might have struck the match himself," said Jean, "but you're so clever that you would not say a thing like that unless you had proof." "We found 2 matches in the hall outside," said Jack, "and when Dr. Thun was searched, no matches were found on him. And I have since learnt that, like most homicidal lunatics, he had a horror of fire in any form. The doctor to whom I have been talking is absolutely sure that he would not have struck the match himself. Oh, by the way, Miss Briggerland, your father met this unfortunate man. I understand he paid a visit to the asylum a few days ago." "Yes, he did," she answered without hesitation. "He was talking about him this morning. You see, father has been making a tour of the asylums. He is writing a book about such things. Father was horrified when he heard the man had escaped, because the doctor told him that he was a particularly dangerous lunatic. But who would have imagined he would have turned up here?" Her big, sad eyes were fixed on Jack as she shook her head in wonder. "If one had read that in a book, one would never have believed it, would one?" "And the man Hoggins," said Jack, who did not share her wonder. "He was by way of being an acquaintance of yours, a member of your father's club, wasn't he?" She knit her brows. "I don't remember the name. But if he is a very bad character," she said with a little smile, "I should say distinctly that he was a member of father's club. Poor daddy, I don't think he will ever regenerate the East End." "I don't think he will," agreed Jack heartily. "The question is whether the East End will ever regenerate him." A slow smile dawned on her face. "How unkind," she said, mockery in her eyes now. "I wonder why you dislike him so. He is so very harmless, really. My dear," she turned to the girl with a gesture of helplessness, "I'm afraid that even in this affair Mr. Glover is seeing my sinister influence." "You're the most unsinister person I have ever met, Jean," laughed Lydia, "and Mr. Glover doesn't really think all these horrid things." "Doesn't he?" said Jean softly, and Jack saw that she was shaking with laughter. There was a certain deadly humour in the situation which tickled him too, and he grinned. "I wish to heaven you'd get married and settle down, Miss Briggerland," he said incautiously. It was her chance. She shook her head, the lips drooped, the eyes again grew moist with the pain she could call to them at will. "I wish I could," she said in a tone a little above a whisper. "But, Jack, I could never marry you, never." She left Jack Glover bereft of speech, totally incapable of arousing so much as a moan. Lydia, returning from escorting her visitor to the door, saw his embarrassment and checked his impulsive explanation a little coldly. "I I believed you when you said it wasn't true, Mr. Glover," she said, and there was a reproach in her tone for which she hated herself afterwards. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 16. Lydia had promised to go to the theatre that night with Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, and she was glad of the excuse to leave her tragic home. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, who was not lavish in the matter of entertainments that cost money, had a box, and although Lydia had seen the piece before, it was in fact the very place she had attended to sketch dresses on the night of her adventure. It was a relief to sit in silence, which her hostess, with singular discretion, did not attempt to disturb. It was during the last act that Mrs. Cole-Mortimer gave her an invitation which she accepted joyfully. "I've got a house at Cap Martin," said Mrs. Cole-Mortimer. "It is only a tiny place, but I think you would rather like it. I hate going to the Riviera alone, so if you care to come as my guest, I shall be most happy to chaperon you. They are bringing my yacht down to Monaco, so we ought to have a really good time." Lydia accepted the yacht and the house as she had accepted the invitation, without question. That the yacht had been chartered that morning, and the house hired by telegram on the previous day, she could not be expected to guess. For all she knew, Mrs. Mortimer might be a very wealthy woman, and in her wildest dreams she did not imagine that Jean Briggerland had provided the money for both. It had not been a delicate negotiation, because Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had the skin of a pachyderm. A hint dropped by Jean that there was somebody on the Riviera whom she desired to meet, without her father's knowledge, accompanied by the plain statement that she would pay all expenses, was quite sufficient for Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, and she had fallen in with her patron's views as readily as she had agreed to pose as a friend of Meredith's. To do her justice, she had the faculty of believing in her own invention, and she was quite satisfied that James Meredith had been a great personal friend of hers, just as she would believe that the house on the Riviera and the little steam yacht had been procured out of her own purse. It was harder for her, however, to explain the great system which she was going to work in Monte Carlo, and which was to make everybody's fortune. Lydia, who was no gambler and only mildly interested in games of chance, displayed so little evidence of interest in the scheme that Mrs. Cole-Mortimer groaned her despair, not knowing that she was expected to do no more than stir the soil for the crop which Jean Briggerland would plant and reap. They went on to supper at one of the clubs, and Lydia thought with amusement of poor old Jaggs, who apparently took his job very seriously indeed. Again her angle of vision had shifted, and her respect for the old man had overcome any annoyance his uncouth presence brought to her. As she alighted at the door of the club, she looked round, half expecting to see him. The club entrance was up a side street off Leicester Square, an ill-lit thoroughfare which favoured Mr. Jaggs's retiring methods, but there was no sign of him, and she did not wait in the drizzling night to make any closer inspection. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had not disguised the possibility of Jean Briggerland being at the club, and they found her with a gay party of young people, sitting in one of the recesses. Jean made a place for the girl by her side and introduced her to half a dozen people whose names Lydia did not catch and never afterwards remembered. Mr. Marcus Stepney, however, that sleek, dark man who bowed over her hand and seemed as though he were going to kiss it, she had met before, and her second impression of him was even less favourable than the first. "Do you dance?" asked Jean. A jazz band was playing an infectious two-step. At the girl's nod, Jean beckoned one of her party, a tall, handsome boy, who throughout the subsequent dance babbled into Lydia's ear an incessant paean in praise of Jean Briggerland. Lydia was amused. "Of course, she is very beautiful," she said in answer to the interminable repetition of his question. "I think she's lovely." "That's what I say," said the young man, whom she discovered was Lord Stoker. "The most amazingly beautiful creature on the earth, I think." "Of course, you're awfully good-looking too," he blundered, and Lydia laughed aloud. "But she's got enemies," said the young man viciously, "and if ever I meet that infernal cad Glover, he'll be sorry." The smile left Lydia's face. "Mr. Glover is a friend of mine," she said a little quickly. "Sorry," he mumbled, "but does Miss Briggerland say he is so very bad?" "Of course not. She never says a word against him, really." His lordship hastened to exonerate his idol. "She just says she doesn't know how long she's going to stand his persecutions. It breaks one's heart to see how sad this your friend makes her." Lydia was a very thoughtful girl for the rest of the evening. She was beginning, in a hazy way, to see things which she had not seen before. Of course, Jean never said anything against Jack Glover, and yet she had succeeded in arousing this youth to fury against the lawyer, and Lydia realised with a sense of amazement that Jean had also made her feel bad about Jack, and yet she had said nothing but sweet things. When she got back to the flat that night, she found that Mr. Jaggs had not been there all the evening. He came in a few minutes after her, wrapped in an old army coat, and from his appearance she gathered that he had been standing out in the rain and sleet the whole of the evening. "Why, Jaggs," she said impulsively, "wherever have you been?" "Just dodging round, miss," he grunted. "Having a look at the little ducks in the pond." "You've been outside the theatre, and you've been waiting outside Nero's club," she said accusingly. "Don't know it, miss," he said. "One theayter is as much like another one to me." "You must take your things off and let Mrs. Morgan dry your clothes," she insisted, but he would not hear of this, compromising only with stripping his sodden greatcoat. He disappeared into his dark room, there to ruminate upon such matters as appeared of interest to him. A bed had been placed for him, but only once had he slept on it. After the flat grew still and the last click of the switch told that the last light had been extinguished, he opened the door softly, and carrying a chair in his hand, he placed this gently with its back to the front door, and there he sat and dozed throughout the night. When Lydia woke the next morning, he was gone as usual. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 17. Lydia had plenty to occupy her days. The house in Curzon Street had been bought, and she had been a round of furnishers, paper hangers, and fitters of all variety. The trip to the Riviera came at the right moment. She could leave Mrs. Morgan in charge and come back to her new home, which was to be ready in 2 months. Amongst other things, the problem of the watchful Mr. Jaggs would be settled automatically. She spoke to him that night when he came. "By the way, Mr. Jaggs, I am going to the south of France next week." "A pretty place by all accounts," volunteered Mr. Jaggs. "A lovely place, by all accounts," repeated Lydia with a smile. "And you're going to have a holiday, Mr. Jaggs. By the way, what am I to pay you?" "The gentleman pays me, miss," said Mr. Jaggs with a sniff. "The lawyer gentleman." "Well, he must continue paying you whilst I am away," said the girl. "I am very grateful to you, and I want to give you a little present before I go. Is there anything you would like, Mr. Jaggs?" Mr. Jaggs rubbed his beard, scratched his head, and thought he would like a pipe. "Though bless you, miss, I don't want any present." "You shall have the very best pipe I can buy," said the girl. "It seems very inadequate." "I'd rather have a briar, miss," said old Jaggs mistakenly. He was on duty until the morning she left, and although she rose early, he had gone. She was disappointed, for she had not given him the handsome case of pipes she had bought, and she wanted to thank him. She felt she had acted rather meanly towards him. She owed her life to him twice. "Didn't you see him go?" she asked Mrs. Morgan. "No, miss." The stout housekeeper shook her head. "I was up at 6 and he'd gone then, but he'd left his chair in the passage. I've got an idea that's where he slept, miss, if he slept at all." "Poor old man," said the girl gently. "I haven't been very kind to him, have I? And I do owe him such a lot." "Maybe he'll turn up again," said Mrs. Morgan hopefully. She had the mother feeling for the old, which is one of the beauties of her class, and she regretted Lydia's absence probably as much because it would entail the disappearance of old Jaggs as for the loss of her mistress. But old Jaggs did not turn up. Lydia hoped to see him at the station, hovering on the outskirts of the crowd in his furtive way, but she was disappointed. She left by the 11 o'clock train, joining Mrs. Cole-Mortimer on the station. That lady had arranged to spend a day in Paris, and the girl was not sorry, after a somewhat bad crossing of the English Channel, that she had not to continue her journey through the night. The south of France was to be a revelation to her. She had no conception of the extraordinary change of climate and vegetation that could be experienced in one country. She passed from a drizzly, bedraggled Paris into a land of sunshine and gentle breezes, from the bare, sullen lands of the Champagne into a country where flowers grew by the side of the railway, and that in February, to a semi-tropic land, fragrant with flowers, to white beaches by a blue, lazy sea, and a sky over all unflecked by clouds. It took her breath away, the beauty of it, and the sense and genial warmth of it. The trees laden with lemons, the wisteria on the walls, the white dust on the road, and the glory of the golden mimosa that scented the air with its rare and lovely perfume. They left the train at Nice and drove along the Grand Corniche. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had a call to make in Monte Carlo, and the girl sat back in the car and drank in the beauty of this delicious spot, whilst her hostess interviewed the house agent. Surely the place must be kept under glass. It looked so fresh and clean and free from stain. The casino disappointed her. It was a place of plaster and stucco, and did not seem built for permanent use. They drove back part of the way they had come onto the peninsula of Cap Martin, and she had a glimpse of beautiful villas between the pines and queer little roads that led into mysterious dells. Presently the car drew up before a good-looking house. Even Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was surprised into an expression of her satisfaction at the sight of it. Lydia, who thought that this was Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's own domain, was delighted. "You are lucky to have a beautiful home like this, Mrs. Cole-Mortimer," she said. "It must be heavenly living here." The habit of wealth had not been so well acquired that she could realize that she also could have a beautiful house if she wished. She thought of that later. Nor did she expect to find Jean Briggerland there, and Mr. Briggerland, too, sitting on a big cane chair on the veranda overlooking the sea and smoking a cigar of peace. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had been very careful to avoid all mention of Jean on the journey. "Didn't I tell you they would be here?" she said in careless amazement. "Why, of course, dear Jean left 2 days before we did. It makes such a nice little party. Do you play bridge?" Lydia did not play bridge, but was willing to be taught. She spent the remaining hour of daylight exploring the grounds which led down to the road which fringed the sea. She could look across at the lights already beginning to twinkle at Monte Carlo, to the white yachts lying off Monaco, and farther along the coast to a little cluster of lights that stood for Boulogne. "It is glorious," she said, drawing a long breath. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, who had accompanied her in her stroll, purred the purr of the pleased patron whose protege has been thankful for favours received. Dinner was a gay meal, for Jean was in her brightest mood. She had a keen sense of fun, and her sly little sallies, sometimes aimed at her father, sometimes at Lydia's expense, but more often directed at people in the social world whose names were household words, kept Lydia in a constant gurgle of laughter. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer alone was nervous and ill at ease. She had learnt unpleasant news and was not sure whether she should tell the company or keep her secret to herself. In such dilemma weak people take the most sensational course, and presently she dropped her bombshell. "Celeste says that the gardener's little boy has malignant smallpox," she almost wailed. Jean was telling a funny story to the girl who sat by her and did not pause for so much as a second in her narrative. The effect on Mr. Briggerland was, however, wholly satisfactory to Mrs. Cole-Mortimer. He pushed back his chair and blinked at his hostess. "Smallpox?" he said in horror. "Here? In Cap Martin? Good God, did you hear that, Jean?" "Did I hear what?" she asked lazily. "About the gardener's little boy? Oh, yes. There's been quite an epidemic on the Italian Riviera. In fact, they closed the frontier last week." "But here?" spluttered Briggerland. Lydia could only look at him in open-eyed amazement. The big man's terror was pitiably apparent. The copper skin had turned a dirty grey, his lower lip was trembling like a frightened child's. "Why not here?" said Jean coolly. "There's nothing to be scared about. Have you been vaccinated recently?" She turned to the girl, and Lydia shook her head. "Not since I was a baby, and then I believe the operation was not a success." "Anyway, the child is isolated in the cottage, and they are taking him to Nice tonight," said Jean. "Poor little fellow, even his own mother has deserted him. Are you going to the casino?" she asked. "I don't know," replied Lydia. "I'm very tired, but I should love to go." "Take her, father, and you go, Margaret. By the time you return, the infection will be removed." "Won't you come too?" asked Lydia. "No, I'll stay at home tonight. I turned my ankle today, and it is rather stiff. Father." This time her voice was sharp, menacing almost, thought Lydia, and Mr. Briggerland made an heroic attempt to recover his self-possession. "Certainly, my dear. I shall be delighted delighted." He saw her alone whilst Lydia was changing in her lovely big dressing room overlooking the sea. "Why didn't you tell me there was smallpox in Cap Martin?" he demanded fretfully. "Because I didn't know till Margaret relieved her mind at our expense," said his daughter coolly. "I had to say something. Besides, I'd heard one of the maids say that somebody's mother had deserted him. I fitted it in. What a funk you are, father." "I hate the very thought of disease," he growled. "Why aren't you coming with us? There's nothing the matter with your ankle." "Because I prefer to stay at home." He looked at her suspiciously. "Jean," he said in a milder voice, "hadn't we better let up on the girl for a bit, until that lunatic doctor affair has blown over?" She reached out and took a gold case from his waistcoat pocket, extracted a cigarette, and replaced the case before she spoke. "We can't afford to 'let up,' as you call it, for a single hour. Do you realise that any day her lawyer may persuade her to make a will leaving her money to a home for cats or something equally untouchable? If there was no Jack Glover we could afford to wait months, and I'm less troubled about him than I am about the man Jaggs." Father, you will be glad to learn that I am almost afraid of that freakish old man." "Neither of them are here," he began. "Exactly," said Jean. "Neither are here. Lydia had a telegram from him just before dinner asking if he could come to see her next week." At this moment Lydia returned and Jean Briggerland eyed her critically. "My dear, you look lovely," she said, and kissed her. Mr. Briggerland's nose wrinkled, as it always did when his daughter shocked him. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 18. Jean Briggerland waited until she heard the sound of the departing car sink to a faint hum. Then she went up to her room, opened the bureau and took out a long and tightly fitting dust coat that she wore when she was motoring. She had seen a large bottle of peroxide in Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's room. It probably contributed to the dazzling glories of Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's hair, but it was also a powerful germicide. She soaked a big silk handkerchief in a basin of water, to which she added a generous quantity of the drug, and squeezing the handkerchief nearly dry, she knotted it loosely about her neck. A rubber bathing cap she pulled down over her head and smiled at her queer reflection in the glass. Then she found a pair of kid gloves and drew them on. She turned out the light and went softly down the carpeted stairs. The servants were at their dinner, and she opened the front door and crossed the lawn into a belt of trees, beyond which she knew, for she had been in the house 2 days, was the gardener's cottage. A dim light burnt in one of the 2 rooms, and the window was uncurtained. She saw the bed and its tiny occupant, but nobody else was in the room. The maid had said that the mother had deserted the little sufferer, but this was not quite true. The doctor had ordered the mother into isolation, and had sent a nurse from the infection hospital to take her place. That lady at the moment was waiting at the end of the avenue for the ambulance to arrive. Jean opened the door and stepped in, pulling up the saturated handkerchief until it covered nose and mouth. The place was deserted, and without a moment's hesitation she lifted the child, wrapped a blanket about it, and crossed the lawn again. She went quietly up the stairs straight to Lydia's room. There was enough light from the dressing room to see the bed, and unwrapping the blanket she pulled back the covers and laid him gently in the bed. The child was unconscious. The hideous marks of the disease had developed with remarkable rapidity, and he made no sound. She sat down in a chair, waiting. Her almost inhuman calm was not ruffled by so much as a second's apprehension. She had provided for every contingency, and was ready with a complete explanation, whatever happened. Half an hour passed, and then, rising, she wrapped the child in the blanket and carried him back to the cottage. She heard the purr of the motor and footsteps as she flitted back through the trees. First she went to Lydia's room and straightened the bed, spraying the room with the faint perfume which she found on the dressing table. Then she went back again into the garden, stripped off the dust coat, cap and handkerchief, rolling them into a bundle, which she thrust through the bars of an open window which she knew ventilated a cellar. Last of all she stripped her gloves and sent them after the bundle. She heard the voices of the nurse and attendant as they carried the child to the ambulance. "Poor little kid," she murmured. "I hope he gets better." And strangely enough, she meant it. It had been a thrilling evening for Lydia, and she returned to the house at Cap Martin very tired, but very happy. She was seeing a new world, a world the like of which had never been revealed to her, and though she could have slept, and her head did nod in the car, she roused herself to talk it all over again with the sympathetic Jean. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer retired early. Mr. Briggerland had gone up to bed the moment he returned, and Lydia would have been glad to have ended her conversation, since her head reeled with weariness. But Jean was very talkative until "My dear, if I don't go to bed, I shall sleep on the table," smiled Lydia, rising and suppressing a yawn. "I'm so sorry," said the penitent Jean. She accompanied the girl upstairs, her arm about her waist, and left her at the door of her dressing room. A maid had laid out her night things on a big settee, a little to Lydia's surprise, and she undressed quickly. She opened the door of her bedroom, her hand was on a switch, when she was conscious of a faint and not unpleasant odour. It was a clean, pungent smell. "Disinfectant," said her brain mechanically. She turned on the light, wondering where it came from, and then, as she crossed the room, she came in sight of her bed and stopped, for it was saturated with water, water that dropped from the hanging coverlet and made little pools on the floor. From the head of the bed to the foot there was not one dry place. Whosoever had done the work was thorough. Blankets, sheets, pillows were soddened, and from the soaked mass came a faint, acrid aroma which she recognized, even before she saw on the floor an empty bottle labelled peroxide of hydrogen. She could only stand and stare. It was too late to arouse the household, and she remembered that there was a very comfortable settee in the dressing room with a rug and a pillow, and she went back. A few minutes later she was fast asleep. Not so Miss Briggerland, who was sitting up in bed, a cigarette between her lips, a heavy volume on her knees, reading. Such malignant cases are almost without exception rapidly fatal, sometimes so early that no sign of the characteristic symptoms appear at all, she read, and, dropping the book on the floor, extinguished her cigarette on an alabaster tray and settled herself to sleep. She was dozing when she remembered that she had forgotten to say her prayers. "Oh, damn," said Jean, getting out reluctantly to kneel on the cold floor by the side of the bed. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 19. Her maid woke Jean Briggerland at 8 o'clock the next morning. "Oh, miss," she said as she drew up the table for the chocolate, "have you heard about Mrs. Meredith?" Jean blinked open her eyes, slipped into her dressing jacket and sat up with a yawn. "Have I heard about Mrs. Meredith? Many times," she said. "'Bout what somebody did last night, miss." Jean was wide awake now. "What has happened to Mrs. Meredith?" she asked. "Why, miss, somebody played a practical joke on her. Her bed's sopping." "Sopping?" frowned the girl. "Yes, miss," the woman nodded. "They must have poured buckets of water over it, and used up all Mrs. Cole Mortimer's peroxide, what she uses for keeping her hands nice." Jean swung out of her bed and sat looking down at her tiny white feet. "Where did Mrs. Meredith sleep? Why didn't she wake us up?" "She slept in the dressing room, miss. I don't suppose the young lady liked making a fuss." "Who did it?" "I don't know who did it. It's a silly kind of practical joke, and I know none of the maids would have dared, not the French ones." Jean put her feet into her slippers, exchanged her jacket for a gown, and went on a tour of inspection. Lydia was dressing in her room, and the sound of her fresh young voice, as she carolled out of sheer love of life, came to the girl before she turned into the room. One glance at the bed was sufficient. It was still wet, and the empty peroxide bottle told its own story. Jean glanced at it thoughtfully as she crossed into the dressing room. "Whatever happened last night, Lydia?" Lydia turned at the voice. "Oh, the bed, you mean." She made a little face. "Heaven knows. It occurred to me this morning that some person, out of mistaken kindness, had started to disinfect the room. It was only this morning that I recalled the little boy who was ill, and had overdone it." "They've certainly overdone it," said Jean grimly. "I wonder what poor Mrs. Cole Mortimer will say." "You haven't the slightest idea?" "Not the slightest idea," said Lydia, answering the unspoken question. "I'll see Mrs. Cole Mortimer and get her to change your bed. There's another room you could have," suggested Jean. She went back to her own apartment, bathed and dressed leisurely. She found her father in the garden reading the Niçoise under the shade of a bush, for the sun was not warm, but at that hour blinding. "I've changed my plans," she said without preliminary. He looked up over his glasses. "I didn't know you had any," he said with heavy humour. "I intended going back to London and taking you with me," she said unexpectedly. "Back to London?" he said incredulously. "I thought you were staying on for a month." "I probably shall now," she said, pulling up a basket chair and sitting by his side. "Give me a cigarette." "You're smoking a lot lately," he said as he handed his case to her. "I know I am. Have your nerves gone wrong?" She looked at him out of the corner of her eye and her lips curled. "It wouldn't be remarkable if I inherited a little of your yellow streak," she said coolly, and he growled something under his breath. "No, my nerves are all right, but a cigarette helps me to think." "A yellow streak, have I?" Mr. Briggerland was annoyed. "And I've been out since 5 o'clock this morning." He stopped. "Doing what?" she asked curiously. "Never mind," he said with a lofty gesture. Thus they sat, busy with their own thoughts, for a quarter of an hour. "Jean?" "Yes," she said without turning her head. "Don't you think we'd better give this up and get back to London? Lord Stoker is pretty keen on you." "I'm not pretty keen on him," she said decidedly. "He has his regimental pay and £500 a year, 2 estates mortgaged, no brains and a title. What is the use of his title to me? As much use as a coat of paint. Besides which, I am essentially democratic." He chuckled, and there was another silence. "Do you think the lawyer is keen on the girl?" "Jack Glover?" Mr. Briggerland nodded. "I imagine he is," said Jean thoughtfully. "I like Jack. He's clever. He has all the moral qualities which one admires so much in the abstract. I could love Jack myself." "Could he love you?" bantered her father. "He couldn't," she said shortly. "Jack would be a happy man if he saw me stand in Jim Meredith's place in the Old Bailey. No, I have no illusion about Jack's affections." "He's after Lydia's money, I suppose," said Mr. Briggerland, stroking his bald head. "Don't be a fool," was the calm reply. "That kind of man doesn't worry about a girl's money. I wish Lydia was dead," she added without malice. "It would make things so easy and smooth." Her father swallowed something. "You shock me sometimes, Jean," he said, a statement which amused her. "You're such a half and half man," she said with a note of contempt in her voice. "You were quite willing to benefit by Jim Meredith's death. You killed him as cold-bloodedly as you killed poor little Bulford, and yet you must whine and snivel whenever your deeds are put into plain language. What does it matter if Lydia dies now or in 50 years' time?" she asked. "It would be different if she were immortal. You people attach so much importance to human life. The ancients and the Japanese amongst the modern are the only people who have the matter in true perspective. It is no more cruel to kill a human being than it is to cut the throat of a pig to provide you with bacon. There's hardly a dish at your table which doesn't represent wilful murder, and yet you never think of it. But because the man animal can talk and dresses himself or herself in queer animal and vegetable fabrics, and decorates the body with bits of metal and pieces of glittering quartz, you give its life a value which you deny to the cattle within your gates. Killing is a matter of expediency. Permissible if you call it war, terrible if you call it murder. To me it is just killing. If you are caught in the act of killing, they kill you, and people say it is right to do so. The sacredness of human life is a slogan invented by cowards who fear death as you do. Don't you, Jean? He asked in a hushed voice. I fear life without money, she said quietly. I fear long days of work for a callous, leering employer and strap hanging in a crowded tube on my way home to one miserable room and the cold mutton of yesterday. I fear getting up and making my own bed and washing my own handkerchiefs and blouses and renovating last year's hats to make them look like this year's. I fear a poor husband and a procession of children, and doing the housework with an incompetent maid, or maybe without any at all. Those are the things I fear, Mr. Briggerland. She dusted the ash from her dress and got up. I haven't forgotten the life we lived at Ealing, she said significantly. She looked across the bay to Monte Carlo, glittering in the morning sunlight, to the green-capped head of Cap d'Ale, to Beaulieu, a jewel set in grey stone, and shook her head. "It is written," she quoted sombrely, and left him in the midst of the question he was asking. She strolled back to the house and joined Lydia, who was looking radiantly beautiful in a new dress of silver grey charmeuse. Please visit LibriVox.org. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 20. "Have you solved the mystery of the submerged bed?" smiled Jean. Lydia laughed. "I'm not probing too deeply into the matter," she said. "Poor Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was terribly upset." "She would be," said Jean. "It was her own eiderdown." This was the first hint Lydia had received that the house was rented furnished. They drove into Nice that morning, and Lydia, remembering Jack Glover's remarks, looked closely at the chauffeur, and was startled to see a resemblance between him and the man who had driven the taxicab on the night she had been carried off from the theatre. It is true that the taxi driver had a moustache, and that this man was clean shaven, and moreover had tiny side whiskers, but there was a resemblance. "Have you had your driver long?" she asked, as they were running through Monte Carlo along the sea road. "Mordon? Yes, we have had him 6 or 7 years," said Jean carelessly. "He drives us when we are on the Continent, you know. He speaks French perfectly and is an excellent driver. Father has tried to persuade him to come to England, but he hates London. He was telling me the other day that he hadn't been there for 10 years. That disposed of the resemblance, thought Lydia, and yet she could remember his voice, she thought, and when they alighted on the Promenade des Anglais, she spoke to him. He replied in French, and it is impossible to detect points of resemblance in a voice that speaks one language and the same voice when it speaks another. The promenade was crowded with saunterers. A band was playing by the jetty, and although the wind was colder than it had been at Cap Martin, the sun was warm enough to necessitate the opening of a parasol. It was a race week, and the two girls lunched at the Negrito. They were in the midst of their meal when a man came toward them, and Lydia recognized Mr. Marcus Stepney. This dark, suave man was no favourite of hers, though why she could not have explained. His manners were always perfect, and towards her deferential. As usual, he was dressed with the precision of a fashion plate. Mr. Marcus Stepney was a man, a considerable portion of whose time was taken up every morning by the choice of cravats and socks and shirts. Though Lydia did not know this, his smartness plus a certain dexterity with cards was his stock in trade. No breath of scandal had touched him, he moved in a good set, and was always at the right place at the proper season. When Aix was full, he was certain to be found at the Palace. In the Deauville week, you would find him at the casino punting mildly at the baccarat table. and after the rooms were closed, and even the sports club at Monte Carlo had shut its doors, there was always a little game to be had in the hotels and in Marcus Stepney's private sitting room. And it cannot be denied that Mr. Stepney was lucky. He won sufficient at these out-of-hour games to support him nobly through the trials and vicissitudes which the public tables inflict upon their votaries. "Going to the races," he said. "How very fortunate! Will you come along with me? I can give you 3 good winners." "I have no money to gamble," said Jean. "I am a poor woman. Lydia, who is rolling in wealth, can afford to take your tips, Marcus." Marcus looked at Lydia with a speculative eye. "If you haven't any money with you, don't worry. I have plenty, and you can pay me afterwards. I could make you 1,000,000 francs today." "Thank you," said Jean coolly, "but Mrs. Meredith does not bet so heavily." Her tone was a clear intimation to the man of wits that he was impinging upon somebody else's preserves, and he grinned amiably. Nevertheless, it was a profitable afternoon for Lydia. She came back to Cap Martin 20,000 francs richer than she had been when she started off. "Lydia's had a lot of luck, she tells me," said Mr. Briggerland. "Yes, she won about £500," said his daughter. Marcus was laying ground bait. She did not know what horses he had backed until after the race was run, when he invariably appeared with a few mill notes, and Lydia's pleasure was pathetic. Of course she didn't win anything. The 20,000 francs was a sprat. He's coming tonight to see how the whales are blowing. Mr. Marcus Stepney arrived punctually, and, to Mr. Briggerland's disgust, was dressed for dinner, a fact which necessitated the older man's hurried retreat and reappearance in conventional evening wear. Marcus Stepney's behaviour at dinner was faultless. He devoted himself in the main to Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, and Jean, who apparently never looked at him and yet observed his every movement, knew that he was merely waiting his opportunity. It came when the dinner was over and the party adjourned to the big stoop facing the sea. The night was chilly, and Mr. Stepney found wraps and furs for the ladies, and so manoeuvred the arrangement of the chairs that Lydia and he were detached from the remainder of the party, not by any great distance, but sufficient, as the experienced Marcus knew, to remove a murmured conversation from the sharpest eavesdropper. Jean, who was carrying on a three-cornered conversation with her father and Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, did not stir until she saw, by the light of a shaded lamp in the roof, the dark head of Mr. Marcus Stepney droop more confidently towards his companion. Then she rose and strolled across. Marcus did not curse her, because he did not express his inmost thoughts aloud. He gave her his chair and pulled another forward. "Does Miss Briggerland know?" asked Lydia. "No," said Mr. Stepney pleasantly. "May I tell her?" "Of course." "Mr. Stepney has been telling me about a wonderful racing coup to be made tomorrow. Isn't it rather thrilling, Jean? He says it will be quite possible for me to make 5,000,000 francs without any risk at all." "Except the risk of 1,000,000, I suppose," smiled Jean. "Well, are you going to do it?" Lydia shook her head. "I haven't 1,000,000 francs in France for one thing," she said, "and I wouldn't risk it if I had." And Jean smiled again at the discomfiture which Mr. Marcus Stepney strove manfully to hide. Later she took his arm and led him into the garden. "Marcus," she said when they were out of range of the house, "I think you are several kinds of a fool." "Why?" asked the other, who was not in the best humour. "It was so crude," she said scornfully, "so cheap and confidence-trickish. A miserable 1,000,000 francs, 20,000 pounds. Apart from the fact that your name would be mud in London if it were known that you had robbed a girl." "There's no question of robbery," he said hotly. "I tell you Valdau is a certainty for the Prix." "It would not be a certainty if her money were on," said Jean dryly. "It would finish an artistic second, and you would be full of apologies, and poor Lydia would be 1,000,000 francs to the bad. No, Marcus, that is cheap." "I'm nearly broke," he said shortly. He made no disguise of his profession nor of his nefarious plan. Between the two there was a queer kind of camaraderie. Though he may not have been privy to the more tremendous of her crimes, yet he seemed to accept her as one of those who lived on the frontiers of illegality. "I was thinking about you as you sat there telling her this story," said Jean thoughtfully. "Marcus, why don't you marry her?" He stopped in his stride and looked down at the girl. "Marry her, Jean? Are you mad? She wouldn't marry me." "Why not?" she asked. "Of course she'd marry you, you silly fool, if you went the right way about it." He was silent. "She is worth £600,000, and I happen to know that she has nearly £200,000 in cash on deposit at the bank," said Jean. "Why do you want me to marry her?" he asked significantly. "Is there a rake-off for you?" "A big rake-off," she said. "The 200,000 on deposit should be easily get-at-able, Marcus, and she'd even give you more." "Why?" he asked. "To agree to a separation," she said coolly. "I know you. No woman could live very long with you and preserve her reason." He chuckled. "And I'm to hand it all over to you?" "Oh, no," she corrected. "I'm not greedy. It is my experience that the greedy people get into bad trouble. The man or woman who wants it all usually gets the dressing case the all was kept in. No, I'd like to take a half." He sat down on a garden seat and she followed his example. "What is there to be?" he asked. "An agreement between you and me? Something signed and sealed and delivered, eh?" Her sad eyes caught his and held them. "I trust you, Marcus," she said softly. "If I help you in this, and I will if you will do all that I tell you to do, I will trust you to give me my share." Mr. Marcus Stepney fingered his collar a little importantly. "I've never let a pal down in my life," he said with a cough. "I'm as straight as they make 'em to people who play the game with me." "And you are wise so far as I'm concerned," said the gentle Jean. "For if you double-cross me, I would hand the police the name and address of your other wife who is still living." His jaw dropped. What?" he stammered. "Let us join the ladies," mocked Jean, as she rose and put her arm in his. It pleased her immensely to feel this big man trembling. End of chapter 20